The desert wind howled, carrying with it grains of sand that whispered ancient stories, their voices lost in the cacophony of time. Beneath a burning sun, where rivers once flowed with the lifeblood of civilizations, the ancient Near East cradled some of humanity's earliest whispers of greatness. This was not a land that surrendered easily. It demanded resilience, ingenuity, and faith from those who called it home. It was a place of stark contrasts, of fertile valleys bursting with life and parched deserts echoing with silence. Here, in the shadow of mighty rivers like the Tigris, Euphrates, and Nile, humanity rose, not as rulers but as survivors against overwhelming odds. The land itself seemed alive, an unpredictable force that could grant prosperity or snatch it away in an instant. Floodwaters churned through the lowlands, leaving behind fertile soil and shattered dreams. Mountains stood like eternal sentinels, guarding mysteries only the brave dared approach. The seas shimmered deceptively, their depths hiding dangers and blessings alike. The ancient Near East wasn't a single place, but a mosaic, a vibrant tapestry of cultures, each threading its unique story into the fabric of human history. Its boundaries stretched wide, touching the shores of the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, embracing lands we now call Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant. This vastness wasn't empty, it pulsed with life and ambition. The people who walked this earth built empires not just of stone but of spirit, creating legacies that would outlive their crumbled walls. The rivers were veins through which lifeblood flowed, connecting villages and cities like beads on a string. Along their banks, farmers toiled under the blistering sun, their sweat mingling with the soil to coax grain from the earth. Children played in the shadow of towering ziggurats, their laughter mingling with the hum of markets where merchants traded goods and tales from distant lands. In those bustling cities, under skies that seemed to stretch endlessly, gods were born, figures larger than life, yet intimately tied to the very human struggles of those who worshipped them. In the heart of this land, people looked up at the stars with awe and down at the soil with determination. The heavens were a canvas of wonder, charted by priests and scribes who sought meaning in their patterns. Meanwhile, the earth yielded clay tablets on which stories were etched, stories that carried not just words but the heartbeat of a civilization. These tales spoke of gods who walked among mortals, of heroes who faced unimaginable horrors, and of monsters that lurked on the edges of human understanding. The ancient Near East breathed contradictions. It was a place of unimaginable beauty and unrelenting harshness. Sunlight danced across golden sands, and cool breezes carried the scent of blooming flowers in the oases. Yet the same sun could scorch the earth, turning fertile plains into barren wastelands. Life was fragile here, as fleeting as the shadow of a cloud passing over the desert. But in that fragility lay a strength, a refusal to be defeated, a determination to carve existence out of the harshest conditions. In the markets, the hum of life was a symphony of languages and cultures. Traders arrived from across the known world, their camels laden with treasures, lapis lazuli from far-off lands, fragrant spices that perfumed the air, and intricate textiles woven with care. These interactions created a melting pot of ideas, where stories mingled and monsters traveled from one culture to another, transforming as they went. It was in these vibrant exchanges that myths grew roots, spreading across regions and adapting to the landscapes they touched. The nights here were a paradox. They could be terrifyingly silent, with only the distant howl of a jackal breaking the stillness. But they were also moments of connection. Families huddled around fires, their faces glowing in the flickering light, as elders spoke of times when gods and beasts roamed the earth. Children listened wide-eyed, imagining creatures that could swallow the sun or command the wind. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were a reminder of the fragile balance between chaos and order, a balance the people of the ancient Near East knew all too well. Every grain of sand, every brick in every city, seemed to carry a memory. The ruins that remain today are not silent, they whisper of a time when humanity dared to defy nature's cruelty and claim its place. These remnants speak of kings and queens who ruled with wisdom and terror, of priests who bridged the gap between mortal and divine, and of scribes who immortalized their world in lines of cuneiform. And yet, the land itself was the greatest storyteller. It shaped its people as much as they shaped it. When the rivers flooded, they brought not just destruction but renewal. When the mountains erupted in storms, they were seen as the rage of gods. When the earth trembled, it was a reminder of forces beyond human control. The ancient Near East demanded respect, and its inhabitants gave it freely, channeling their awe and fear into myths that continue to resonate. This was a place where survival wasn't guaranteed but earned through courage, sacrifice, and faith. And in the face of these challenges, the people of the ancient Near East created something extraordinary. They didn't just endure, they thrived. From their struggles emerged art, architecture, and stories that would outlive even the most ambitious of their kings. The wind carries a chill that doesn't belong to this world, a breath from an ancient time when the boundaries between gods, humans, and monsters blurred into shadow and flame. In the minds of the people who once walked these lands, the unknown wasn't a void but a teeming abyss filled with creatures that defied understanding. Monsters weren't just nightmares, they were the fabric of existence itself, woven into the very essence of the world. When darkness fell and the stars shimmered like the watchful eyes of forgotten gods, whispers would rise in hushed homes and sacred temples. People spoke of beings born of chaos, entities that roamed the edges of creation, where light faltered and shadows thrived. These creatures weren't distant tales but living forces, tangible reminders of a fragile balance between order and destruction. The ancient Near East breathed with stories of monsters, not as distant terrors but as reflections of a world that seemed as unpredictable as it was magnificent. To the people who shaped these myths, the monsters weren't just adversaries to be feared, they were messengers of truth, warnings from the cosmos itself. They carried the weight of the unknown, embodying fears too vast for human comprehension. In Babylonian myth, the roar of Tiamat echoes like thunder, a sound that sends shivers down the spine even now. She is chaos incarnate, a swirling sea of power and rage. Her serpentine body coils through the primeval waters, her breath thick with fury. To the ancient Babylonians, she wasn't just a monster, she was the primordial womb, the origin of all things. But when the gods rose to challenge her, she became something else, a symbol of defiance, of a world that refuses to bow to the order imposed upon it. Then there was Humbaba, the guardian of the Cedar Forest, a creature whose presence was as awe-inspiring as it was terrifying. With a face said to resemble coiled entrails and a voice like the storm, he was no mere beast. He was a threshold, a test for heroes daring to step beyond the safety of the known. Gilgamesh and Enkidu faced him not just to claim the cedar trees, but to confront the unknown that lurked in their own souls. Humbaba's death wasn't just a victory, it was a loss, a moment when humanity crossed a line, breaking something sacred in its relentless quest for power. The gods themselves often walked hand in hand with monstrosity. The Anzu bird, with its lion's head and eagle's wings, wasn't just a thief who dared to steal the tablet of destinies. It was an embodiment of hubris, a reflection of the dangers that come when one challenges the divine order. Yet, even in its defeat, Anzu wasn't entirely destroyed. Its legacy lingered, a reminder that the monstrous could never truly be vanquished, only held at bay. Monsters were also protectors, guardians of the sacred and the divine. The Lamassu, with its human face, lion's body, and eagle's wings, stood sentinel at temple gates and city walls. But these hybrid beings weren't just architectural wonders, they were living prayers, silent invocations for safety and order. Their presence reassured the faithful, a reminder that even in a world of chaos, there were forces that stood against the storm. Yet, not all monsters were born of divinity. Some emerged from the depths of human fear and suffering. The seven demons, ancient spirits of disease and destruction, were invisible forces that struck without warning. They slithered through the cracks in walls, crept into the minds of the unguarded, and left devastation in their wake. To name them was to summon their power, a dangerous game that only the bravest dared play. Even death itself wore monstrous forms. In the underworld ruled by Ereshkigal, the gates were guarded by creatures whose appearances defied reason. To pass through these thresholds was to face the ultimate unknown, to stand before beings that stripped away the illusions of life and exposed the raw truth of existence. The monsters of the ancient Near East weren't just enemies, they were teachers. They taught the people about the fragility of life, the inevitability of chaos, and the need for courage in the face of the incomprehensible. Their stories weren't just told to frighten children, they were warnings, parables, and even comforts for a world that often seemed as capricious as the gods themselves. And yet, the monsters weren't just horrors, they were also mirrors. They reflected humanity's deepest fears and darkest desires. The serpent coiled in the shadows of creation, the bird with eyes of fire, the demon riding the desert winds, they all spoke of a truth that couldn't be ignored. In their monstrous forms, they carried pieces of humanity, fragments of the unknown that lived within every soul. The stars above offered no answers, only questions. Why did the gods create these creatures? Why did they allow chaos to remain? These were the thoughts that lingered in the hearts of those who gathered around fires to hear the tales. And as the stories were told, the lines between monster and man blurred, leaving only the haunting realization that the two were never truly separate. The ancient Near East was a land where the monstrous thrived, not in the shadows but in the light, walking alongside gods and mortals alike. Their presence wasn't just tolerated, it was essential. They were the chaos to the gods' order, the darkness to the light, the fear that gave courage its meaning. And in their terrifying forms, they carried the weight of a world too vast, too wild, and too beautiful to ever be fully tamed. Before there was light, before the earth took shape, there was chaos, boundless, formless, infinite. The ancient stories spoke of a void so vast and consuming that even the gods feared it. It was not a peaceful emptiness, but a writhing, restless thing, pulsing with the raw potential of creation and destruction. From this primal chaos, the first beings were born, their forms incomprehensible, their presence overwhelming. They were not gods, not yet, but forces of nature, untamed and wild. In the Babylonian myth, the waters of Apsu and Tiamat churned in a timeless embrace. Apsu, the fresh waters, and Tiamat, the salt waters, mingled in a dance that birthed creation itself. But their union wasn't one of harmony, it was a tempest, a meeting of opposites that sparked life. From their chaotic depths, the first gods emerged, fragile, imperfect, and full of ambition. Yet, this act of creation came at a cost. Tiamat, the mother of all, grew restless. She saw the gods as unruly children, their noise and schemes an insult to her primordial nature. And so, she birthed her monstrous offspring, beings crafted from the very essence of chaos. They were not creatures of flesh and bone but of nightmares and storms, their forms shifting and terrifying. Among them were serpents with venomous breath, dragons with unblinking eyes, and lions with wings that darkened the sky. These were not merely monsters, they were extensions of Tiamat's wrath, her chaotic will-given form. The earth trembled beneath the weight of these creatures, their movements reshaping the very fabric of existence. The gods, though powerful, were paralyzed with fear. How could they face beings born from the same chaos that had given them life? In this moment of despair, Marduk rose, a young god with fire in his heart and courage in his veins. He stood before Tiamat, his voice steady, and challenged her and her children. The battle that followed was more than a clash of power, it was the birth of order itself. Marduk wielded a net to trap Tiamat, a bow to pierce her, and a wind to fill her gaping maw. When he struck her down, her body split open, and from her remains, he shaped the heavens and the earth. But her monstrous offspring were not so easily destroyed. They lingered, scattered across the edges of the world, reminders that chaos could never be fully vanquished. In the myths of the Hittites, another tale of primordial chaos unfolds. There was the dragon Illuyanka, a creature so vast and powerful that it threatened the very gods themselves. Illuyanka was not just a dragon, it was chaos incarnate, a living challenge to the order the gods sought to create. When the storm god Tarhan faced Illuyanka, the battle was fierce and unending. Illuyanka swallowed Tarhan's strength, leaving the god weakened and humiliated. But Tarhan was relentless. He struck a bargain, using trickery and sacrifice to defeat Illuyanka and reclaim his power. Yet, even in victory, the shadow of the dragon lingered, a haunting presence in the world the gods had shaped. Primordial beings often carried with them a duality, creators and destroyers, parents of gods and monsters alike. In the myths of ancient Egypt, the waters of none stretched endlessly, a boundless sea of potential. From this ocean rose Adam, the first god, who brought forth life through sheer will. But Adam's creation wasn't without its shadows. From the chaotic waters also came serpents and beasts, creatures that slithered through the cracks of existence, challenging the divine order. The serpentine figure of Apep, the great enemy of Ra, emerged as a manifestation of this primordial chaos. Apep, the devourer of light, sought to swallow the sun and plunge the world back into the eternal night. Each dawn was a battle, as Ra sailed through the underworld, confronting Apep in a struggle that echoed the balance of creation itself. Apep was never truly defeated, it always returned, a reminder that chaos was eternal, lurking just beneath the surface. Chaos didn't just birth monsters, it gave them purpose. These beings were not evil in the way modern minds might interpret them. They were forces of nature, embodying the wild, untamed aspects of the world. They were the floodwaters that destroyed villages but also brought fertile soil. They were the storms that tore apart homes but also cleared the skies for new beginnings. The people who told these stories didn't see monsters as villains but as essential parts of the cosmic dance. The ancient peoples knew that creation and chaos were intertwined, two sides of the same coin. For every god that brought order, there was a monster born of the chaos they sought to tame. These monsters didn't just live in stories, they lived in the land, in the rivers that could flood without warning, in the deserts that swallowed travelers whole, and in the mountains that loomed like ancient sentinels. Even the act of storytelling itself was an attempt to wrest order from chaos, to give shape to the unknowable forces that surrounded them. By naming the monsters, by giving them forms and faces, the ancient people found a way to confront their fears. They couldn't defeat chaos, but they could understand it, live with it, and even find beauty in its terrifying power. In every crack of thunder, in every shadow that danced on the edge of a firelight, the echoes of these primordial beings could be felt. They were never truly gone, never fully tamed. They lingered in the stories passed down through generations, in the symbols carved into temple walls, and in the quiet moments when the world seemed vast and incomprehensible. Chaos was not just the beginning, it was the heartbeat of existence, pulsing through the myths, the monsters, and the world itself. The air was heavy with the scent of cedar, ancient and eternal, as if the forest itself had been breathing for millennia. The towering trees stretched upward, their tops disappearing into a misty canopy that seemed to touch the sky. It wasn't just a forest, it was alive, a sacred realm where mortals weren't meant to tread. Beneath the shadowy boughs, something stirred, a presence both unseen and undeniable. Humbaba. The name alone carried weight, whispered in reverence and fear. The guardian of the Cedar Forest was no ordinary creature. His breath was fire, his roar was the storm, and his face, twisting, shifting, was a nightmare carved from the chaos of the world's beginnings. He wasn't a monster that merely haunted the forest, he was its heart, its soul. To step into his domain was to challenge not just him but the gods who had placed him there. Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, was not a man who knew fear. His name was etched into the annals of time, his deeds echoing through the land. Yet, even he could feel the weight of what lay ahead as he and Enkidu, his wild-hearted companion, stood at the edge of the forest. The sunlight faltered at the threshold, swallowed by the looming trees. Somewhere beyond, Humbaba waited, his gaze piercing the distance, sensing their every step. Enkidu's hands trembled, though he tried to hide it. He had grown up in the wilderness, among animals and the untamed wild, but even he knew that this forest was different. It wasn't just nature, it was sacred chaos, and Humbaba was its keeper. As they stepped deeper into the woods, the air grew still, the silence punctuated by the creak of ancient branches. The forest seemed to watch them, every shadow a pair of unseen eyes. When Humbaba finally appeared, it was like the earth itself had come to life. His body was massive, his skin a tapestry of twisting vines and hardened bark. His face, indescribable in its terror, seemed to shift with every glance, a grotesque mask that was both man and beast. His voice boomed through the forest, a thunderclap that shook the ground beneath their feet. Who dares disturb the sacred trees? Gilgamesh stood firm, his sword gleaming in the dim light, though his heart pounded like a war drum. He declared his intent, his words bold but tinged with an edge of uncertainty. To him, this wasn't just a battle, it was a test of his strength, his legacy. But Humbaba was unmoved. "You are nothing but fleeting breath," the guardian said, his voice heavy with ancient disdain. "The gods gave me this forest to protect, and I will not let mortals defile it." The fight that followed was unlike any Gilgamesh had ever faced. Humbaba's strength was not of this world. His blows shook the earth, his roars split the air, and his fire breath scorched the ground. It was as if the entire forest fought alongside him, roots and branches lashing out like living weapons. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu were relentless. They struck with the desperation of men who knew they were trespassing on sacred ground, who understood that their victory was not guaranteed. The clash of steel against wood and stone filled the air, a cacophony of life and death. As the battle raged, there were moments when Humbaba seemed almost human. His rage faltered, and his eyes, deep, ancient, sorrowful, betrayed something more. He wasn't just a monster. He was a being with purpose, bound to this forest by forces greater than himself. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu finally brought him to his knees, the air grew heavy with an unspoken grief. Humbaba pleaded, his voice now softer, carrying the weight of ages. "Spare me, and the gods will bless you. I am but a servant, a guardian. If you kill me, you kill the soul of this forest." Enkidu hesitated, his wild instincts warring with the knowledge of what they were about to do. But Gilgamesh, driven by ambition and the thirst for glory, ignored the plea. With a final, devastating blow, they ended Humbaba's life. The forest let out a mournful sigh, the trees swaying as if in grief. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that settles after something sacred is broken. Gilgamesh and Enkidu stood over Humbaba's lifeless form, their victory hollow, their triumph stained with a loss they couldn't fully understand. The cedar trees wept resin like blood, their towering forms suddenly less imposing, as though the spirit of the forest had dimmed. Gilgamesh, for all his strength, couldn't shake the weight that settled over him. In slaying Humbaba, he had proved his might, but he had also crossed a line. The gods would not forget this act, nor would the earth itself. Humbaba wasn't just a guardian, he was a warning. His death was a reminder that humanity's reach often exceeds its grasp, that the sacred and the wild are not things to be conquered but to be respected. As Gilgamesh and Enkidu left the forest, carrying the cedar logs that had cost them so much, the wind carried the faint echo of Humbaba's roar, a sound that would haunt them long after they had left his domain. The cedar forest would never be the same, its guardian gone, its spirit diminished. And though Gilgamesh had gained what he sought, he had lost something far greater, a piece of the world's wonder, a connection to the sacred chaos that gave life its meaning. In the beginning, before the gods walked the earth and the stars found their places in the sky, there was only Tiamat. She was not like anything we know, no gentle mother or nurturing spirit. She was the sea, vast and boundless, her waves rolling endlessly in a silent, eternal darkness. But within her depths was more than water, it was chaos itself, pulsing with the raw energy of creation. Tiamat was not alone. Apsu, her counterpart, flowed alongside her, fresh waters mingling with her salty depths. Together, they were the cradle of existence, the wellspring of all life. But where Apsu was calm and steady, Tiamat was restless, her nature wild and untamed. She was both creator and destroyer, her every movement shaping the world in ways both beautiful and terrible. From their union, the first gods were born. They were young, reckless, and full of ambition, their presence a cacophony that pierced the quiet depths of Tiamat's domain. The gods were not content to live in her shadow. They sought to build, to rule, to shape the world as they saw fit. But their noise, their endless meddling, was a thorn in the side of Apsu. He wanted peace, a return to the quiet simplicity of the beginning. Apsu's frustration grew until he could bear it no longer. He planned to silence the gods forever, to end their chaos and reclaim the serenity of his existence. But his intentions were discovered, and before he could act, the gods struck him down. His death rippled through the waters, a wound that could not heal. Tiamat felt the loss like a knife in her depths. Her companion, her partner, gone. And with his death, something within her shifted. The calm surface of the sea began to churn, and the quiet grief she carried transformed into something fierce and unstoppable. She was no longer just the mother of gods, she became their enemy. In her fury, Tiamat did what no one expected. She created. From her depths came monsters, beings shaped not with love but with rage. Each one was a testament to her power and her wrath, dragons with scales as hard as stone, serpents that breathed fire, beasts with claws like blades. These were not children meant to carry on her legacy. They were weapons, born to destroy. Among them was Kingu, her chosen champion. She placed him at her side, gave him the Tablet of Destinies, and proclaimed him the leader of her monstrous army. Together, they marched against the gods, the very children she had once brought into being. The gods were paralyzed with fear. How could they stand against the force that had given them life? Tiamat was more than a foe, she was a force of nature, her power as boundless as the sea. They watched as her monsters filled the skies and seas, a terrifying reminder of her dominion. But one god, Marduk, stepped forward. He was young and bold, unafraid of the challenge that lay before him. He made a pact with the other gods. If he could defeat Tiamat, they would grant him supreme authority over the heavens and the earth. Desperation drove them to agree, their hopes pinned on the strength of one. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat was like nothing the world had ever seen. The sea roared as she rose to her full height, her form a massive serpent-like dragon that blotted out the horizon. Her mouth opened wide, a chasm of chaos, ready to swallow the defiant god. But Marduk was prepared. With his net, he trapped her, his arrows piercing her flesh. The winds he summoned filled her mouth, swelling her until she could no longer fight. With a final, earth-shaking blow, he struck her down, splitting her body in two. From her remains, he crafted the world, the heavens from one half of her body, the earth from the other. But Tiamat was not gone. Her legacy endured, etched into the fabric of creation itself. The monsters she birthed were scattered, their forms reshaping into the fears that haunted humanity for generations. Her story was told and retold, not as a tale of defeat but as a reminder of the chaotic force that had given birth to the world. Tiamat was not just a dragon or a monster. She was chaos, creation, and destruction all at once. She was the darkness that existed before light, the wild, untamable force that could never truly be extinguished. Even in death, her presence lingered, a shadow on the edge of the god's triumph, a whisper in the waves of the sea. To speak of Tiamat is to speak of beginnings, the messy, violent, beautiful chaos from which everything arises. And though she was defeated, her story remains, a powerful testament to the forces that shape the world and the fragile balance between order and chaos that holds it together. The sun hung low over the mountains, casting long shadows across the jagged cliffs. The air was thick with silence, heavy and unbroken, save for the occasional whistle of the wind. Perched on a rocky crag, the Anzu bird stood motionless, its massive wings folded against its body. Its lion's head turned slowly, golden eyes scanning the horizon with a piercing intensity that could see through stone and shadow alike. This was no ordinary creature, it was power given form, a force that defied the very gods themselves. Anzu's feathers shimmered, each one an intricate pattern of gold and bronze, reflecting the dying light like molten metal. Its talons, sharp enough to tear through the hardest stone, gripped the rock as if it were the heart of the earth itself. It was a creature born of the winds and the wild, a symbol of the untamed forces that existed beyond mortal comprehension. But Anzu was not content to remain a mere symbol. Its heart burned with a fire that could not be contained, a desire that set it apart even from the divine. It began with the Tablet of Destinies. To the gods, the tablet was more than a relic, it was the key to their power, the source of their authority over the heavens and the earth. Whoever possessed it could control the fate of the universe, shaping it to their will. It was a treasure guarded with unmatched vigilance, hidden away in the most sacred halls of the gods. And yet, Anzu had stolen it. The theft was unthinkable, an act of rebellion so audacious it sent shockwaves through the heavens. The gods, mighty and eternal, were shaken to their core. How could this creature, a guardian of the wilds, dare to take what was not meant for mortal or beast? Yet Anzu had done it, snatching the Tablet of Destinies in a moment of cunning brilliance. It had not been an act of madness or impulse, but of purpose. Anzu carried the tablet to its lair, high above the world, where no god or mortal could reach. It perched there, the tablet clutched in its talons, its golden eyes blazing with defiance. It was a statement, a challenge to the order that the gods had imposed upon the universe. Anzu was no servant, no pawn in the grand schemes of the divine. It was a force unto itself, a creature that demanded to be seen and heard. The gods convened in their great halls, their voices rising like thunder as they debated what to do. The theft of the tablet had thrown the cosmos into chaos, disrupting the balance of creation. Without the tablet, the gods' powers were weakened, their control slipping like sand through their fingers. They needed a hero, someone who could face Anzu and retrieve the stolen treasure. Several gods were chosen, each one powerful in their own right, but one by one, they faltered. Anzu was no ordinary foe. It moved with the speed of the wind, its claws cutting through divine armor as if it were paper. Its roar shook the heavens, a sound that could turn courage into fear and resolve into doubt. It was Ninurta, the warrior god, who finally rose to the challenge. He was young and bold, his heart filled with a fire that matched Anzu's own. Armed with his bow and the blessings of the gods, he ascended the cliffs, his every step a test of his resolve. The air grew colder as he climbed, the wind howling like a warning. When Ninurta reached the peak, he saw Anzu perched against the backdrop of the setting sun, its form outlined in flames of gold and crimson. The Tablet of Destinies rested beneath its talons, a prize that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Anzu turned its head slowly, meeting Ninurta's gaze with a look that was both challenge and acknowledgement. The battle that followed was unlike anything the world had ever known. Anzu's wings beat against the air, creating gusts so powerful they could level mountains. Its claws struck with the force of 1,000 storms, each blow a reminder of its unmatched strength. But Ninurta was relentless. His arrows flew true, piercing the air with deadly precision. For hours, they clashed, the sky darkening as the stars watched in silence. Each strike, each roar, each cry of defiance echoed through the heavens. Anzu fought not just for itself, but for the wild, for the untamed forces that refused to be chained. Ninurta fought for the gods, for order and the restoration of balance. In the end, it was cunning that decided the battle. Ninurta, seeing that brute strength would not prevail, turned the winds against Anzu. Using his divine powers, he summoned a storm that trapped the great bird, its wings caught in a vortex it could not escape. With a final, devastating blow, Ninurta struck Anzu down, the Tablet of Destinies slipping from its grasp. Anzu fell, its body crumpling against the rocky peak. Yet even in defeat, it did not bow. Its golden eyes, dimmed but unbroken, stared at Ninurta with a defiance that would not fade. It had lost the battle, but its spirit remained, a reminder that even the gods could be challenged. Ninurta returned the Tablet of Destinies to the gods, restoring their power and the balance of the cosmos. But the story of Anzu lived on, told and retold as a testament to the wild, untamed spirit that had dared to defy the divine. Anzu was more than a creature or a thief. It was a symbol of rebellion, of the eternal struggle between order and chaos, a force that could never truly be subdued. Night falls heavier than usual, the air trembling with a chill that seeps into the bones. The world feels stretched thin, as if the veil between the seen and unseen has frayed. Somewhere in the silence, a faint sound rises, low whispers, like dry leaves scraping across stone. They come from nowhere and everywhere at once, a sound too ancient to place yet too unsettling to ignore. They are here. The 7 demons are not bound by form or flesh. They are shadows in the corners of the room, the cold draft that extinguishes the flame, the fever that strikes without warning. Each one is a fragment of chaos, a shard of malice born from the cracks of the world itself. They do not walk, they seep. They do not speak, they press against the mind, filling it with dread so profound it paralyzes. Long ago, they had names, whispered only in fear, carved into clay tablets by trembling hands. The ancients knew better than to call upon them openly. The demons were forces of destruction, each more insidious than the last. They did not strike with swords or claws. Their weapons were disease, despair, and disarray. Where they passed, life withered, the air grew foul, and hope was smothered like a flame underwater. The eldest of the seven was no king but a herald of pestilence, carrying sickness on its wings. It moved like smoke, entering homes through cracks too small for mortal eyes to see. The first signs of its presence were subtle, a cough, a shiver, but soon it became an uncontrollable wave. Entire villages succumbed, their lifeblood stolen by something they could neither see nor fight. The second demon thrived in disorder. Its power lay in confusion, in tearing apart the fragile threads that held communities together. It sowed mistrust among friends, turned allies into enemies. The more chaos it created, the stronger it became. Families turned on each other, leaders were overthrown in fits of paranoia. By the time its victims realized they had been played, the damage was already done. The third carried fire, but not the comforting fire of hearth and home. It was a wild, hungry blaze that consumed all in its path, leaving only ash and ruin. No offerings could appease it, no prayers could stop it. It was the destroyer of fields, the ruin of granaries. Starvation followed in its wake, a silent killer that lingered long after the flames had died. The fourth demon thrived on fear. It whispered nightmares into the minds of the vulnerable, turning their dreams into horrors so vivid they blurred the line between waking and sleeping. People went mad under its influence, their eyes hollow, their voices filled with nonsensical ramblings. It was not content with the body, it feasted on the soul, leaving behind empty shells of what once were. The fifth struck the earth itself. Crops withered under its gaze, rivers dried, and the skies withheld their rain. It brought famine, not as a punishment but as a reminder of its power. Children cried out for food, their voices hoarse and weak, as their parents stared helplessly at barren fields. The sixth was a master of shadows. It thrived in the dark, feeding on the isolation of its victims. Those it touched became hollow, their will drained until they were little more than living corpses. It needed no weapon but the weight of despair, pressing so heavily on its prey that even standing became a monumental effort. The youngest of the seven was the most dangerous. It thrived not on destruction but on temptation, offering fleeting relief to those in their darkest moments. A whisper, a promise, a deal too good to refuse, its victims gave away their humanity piece by piece, unaware of what they had lost until nothing remained. The seven demons moved as one, their presence heralded by signs too subtle for most to notice. Dogs howled into the night. Birds took flight for no reason, their wings beating against the sky thick with dread. Fires burned low, as if the very air had turned against them. And then, they struck. They did not discriminate. Kings in their gilded halls fell as easily as peasants in their humble huts. Temples offered no sanctuary, the sacred spaces of gods were no barrier to their creeping influence. Those who tried to fight found their swords useless, their chants hollow. The demons were not of the physical world, they were of the cracks, the spaces in between, the forgotten corners where light dared not tread. Yet, for all their terror, the seven demons were not without purpose. They were reminders of the fragile balance of existence, of how easily the thread of life could fray. They were chaos, yes, but chaos that forced humanity to confront its weaknesses, to find strength in the face of overwhelming odds. Stories tell of those who stood against them, not with weapons, but with resolve. Priests who burned sacred herbs, their chants echoing into the night. Mothers who clutched their children close, their love forming a shield that even the demons could not penetrate. Communities that came together, their unity stronger than the forces that sought to tear them apart. But these victories were fleeting. The seven demons could not be destroyed, only banished, their essence sinking back into the cracks of the world to wait for another moment of weakness. They were eternal, as old as the winds and the earth, bound not by time but by the cycles of human fear and folly. To speak their names was to invite their attention. To ignore them was to risk their wrath. And so, they lingered in the stories of the ancients, warnings carved into clay and whispered across generations. The 7 demons were never truly gone. There were shadows on the edge of the firelight, whispers in the stillness of the night, a presence that could be felt even when unseen. And when the air grows heavy and the silence becomes too loud, one cannot help but wonder, are they watching now? The wind rises, carrying a sound that is not quite a howl, not quite a whisper. It shifts and swirls, twisting through cracks in walls and rustling through the branches of trees. There is an unease in its movement, as if it carries more than just the air. It speaks of unseen eyes and unknowable intentions, a presence both haunting and strangely comforting. Pazuzu, the demon of the wind, is here. His face is etched with terror, sharp teeth bared, eyes wide and staring, a visage meant to freeze the blood of those who see it. His body is twisted, part man, part beast, with talons for feet and the wings of a bird. Yet there is something more to him, something that defies simple labels of good or evil. He is not a simple monster. He is a paradox, a creature of destruction who also guards against the darkness. To understand him is to feel the wind itself, wild, unpredictable, capable of both soothing and destroying. On some days, it brushes gently against the skin, carrying the scent of rain and flowers. On others, it rages, tearing roofs from homes and hurling sand and dust into the air until the world becomes unrecognizable. Pazuzu is this contradiction made flesh. He is the guardian against Lamassu, a demoness of unspeakable cruelty. Lamassu preys on pregnant women and newborns, stealing their breath in the dead of night. Her hunger is endless, her malice boundless. Pazuzu, for all his fearsome appearance, stands as a shield against her. His image is carved onto amulets worn by mothers, his name invoked in desperate prayers to keep the fragile spark of life safe from the shadow that seeks to snuff it out. And yet, Pazuzu is not a benevolent savior. He is a bringer of storms, of droughts, of illness carried on the hot desert wind. To call upon him is to gamble, for his protection comes at a price. His help is not a promise of safety but a calculated risk, a wager made in the hope that his wrath will not turn against those who summon him. The ancients knew his duality well. They feared him, revered him, and relied on him in equal measure. His statues stood in homes, small and crude yet filled with power. His name was spoken in hushed tones, a word that carried weight and meaning far beyond its sound. To invoke Pazuzu was to acknowledge the chaos of the world, to admit that safety could never be guaranteed, only borrowed. In the searing heat of the desert, where the wind is both a lifeline and a threat, Pazuzu thrives. He rides the gusts, unseen but felt, a presence that cannot be ignored. When the storms come, ripping through the landscape with relentless fury, they bear his mark. The air grows thick with dust and sand, the sky turns an unnatural shade, and the world seems to hold its breath. In those moments, one cannot help but wonder if he is watching, his terrible face hidden behind the swirling chaos. Yet, there is a strange comfort in his presence. To wear his amulet is to say, I see you. I know your power. I respect it. It is a bargain, a fragile truce between human and demon, between order and chaos. Mothers clutch these amulets as they sing lullabies to their children, their voices trembling with both love and fear. They trust that Pazuzu will keep Lamassu at bay, even as they feel the weight of his gaze upon them. Stories of Pazuzu speak of his cunning, his ability to manipulate the winds to his advantage. He is no mindless force but a creature of intelligence and will. He chooses when to protect and when to destroy, his motives as shifting as the air itself. Those who underestimate him do so at their peril, for he is as quick to turn as the breeze that carries him. There is a tale of a village caught in the grip of an unending drought. The land cracked beneath their feet, their crops withered to dust. In desperation, they called upon Pazuzu, begging for relief. The wind rose, howling through the night, and the rain came. But it came with such force that it flattened their fields, washed away their homes, and left them worse off than before. Pazuzu had answered, but his answer was a reminder of his power, not his mercy. Even so, he is not a creature of pure malice. He understands the balance of the world, the fragile line between creation and destruction. He fights against Lamassu not out of kindness, but because her unchecked hunger threatens to disrupt this balance. In his own way, Pazuzu maintains order, though his methods are anything but gentle. To the ancients, he was a reminder of life's unpredictability, of the thin barrier that separates safety from chaos. They saw in him the power of the wind, a force that could carry life-giving rains or sweep away entire civilizations. He was both their fear and their hope, a contradiction they could not live without. Even now, his story lingers in the winds that sweep across the desert and the storms that rise without warning. His image, though ancient, still holds a strange power, a connection to a time when the world felt larger and more untamed. To think of Pazuzu is to feel the wind on your face, to hear its voice and wonder what it carries. Is it a warning, a promise, or something in between? The answer, like Pazuzu himself, is never simple. The sun dips low on the horizon, casting golden light over the towering gates of a city that has stood for centuries. Its walls are strong, carved from stone that seems to hum with an ancient power. At the entrance, two figures loom, larger than life, their forms blending the grace of the human with the strength of the animal. They are the Lamassu and Apep, the silent guardians, watching over the city with unwavering resolve. Each detail of their massive bodies tells a story. Their faces are human, serene yet commanding, eyes carved to pierce through time itself. Their bodies are powerful, part bull or lion, symbols of strength and ferocity. Wings stretch outward, feathered with such precision that one could almost feel the air ripple as they move. These beings are not just statues, they are alive in the imagination, embodiments of protection and divine authority. There is a stillness around them that feels unshakable. Travelers pause as they pass beneath their gaze, their steps faltering as an invisible weight presses on their shoulders. It's as if the guardians are measuring their intentions, peeling back the layers of their hearts to see what lies within. They stand as a promise and a warning, peace for those who mean no harm, and unyielding resistance for those who do. Stories whisper that the Lamassu and Apep were more than stone. In the shadowy corners of temples, scribes spoke of their spirits, alive and vigilant. They were said to be born of the god's will, protectors summoned to guard sacred spaces and ensure harmony within the city's walls. Their presence wasn't mere ornamentation, it was a statement of power, a declaration that the city they watched over was blessed and defended by forces beyond human understanding. The Lamassu, with its human head and bull's body, radiated a masculine energy, a guardian of strength and order. Its gaze carried an unspoken authority, demanding respect and offering reassurance to those who lived under its protection. The Apep, often portrayed with the form of a lion, carried a fiercer, wilder energy. Together, they balanced each other, a partnership that symbolized the duality of protection and aggression, calm and chaos. People believed these guardians could see everything. It was said their spirits roamed the city at night, invisible but present, their wings stirring the air as they moved. Children whispered tales of how they had seen a shadow pass swiftly through the streets or felt the faint rustle of wings even when the night was still. Farmers, returning late from the fields, claimed to have caught glimpses of glowing eyes watching from the city's edge, a silent assurance that no harm would befall them. But the guardians were not there merely to inspire awe. They were protectors in the truest sense, their power invoked in times of crisis. When invaders threatened the city, the people would gather at the gates, placing offerings at the feet of the Lamassu and Apep. They would pray for strength, for the courage to defend their homes, believing that these divine beings would channel their energy into the warriors preparing for battle. There is one story, often repeated but never written, of a siege that lasted months. The enemy was relentless, their numbers vast, their weapons deadly. The city's defenders were exhausted, their spirits nearly broken. One night, as the soldiers prepared for what they believed would be their final stand, a storm rose without warning. The winds howled, shaking the earth, and in the chaos, some swore they saw the Lamassu and Apep move. Their wings stretched wide, and their voices roared like thunder. By morning, the enemy was gone, scattered by a force they could not explain. Even now, their legacy endures. Their images appear in art, their forms replicated in stone and clay. but none capture the essence of standing before them, feeling their silent power. They remind us of the fragile line between the human and the divine, the balance that must be maintained to ensure peace. They are protectors, yes, but also reminders of what it means to guard something precious, to stand firm against the forces that would threaten it. To walk beneath their gaze is to feel small and yet somehow safe, to understand that there is a strength greater than any individual, a force that watches and protects. They are the guardians of what we hold dear, the silent sentinels of a world that believed in the power of the unseen. The air grows colder as the path descends, a chill that seeps into the bones. Each step feels heavier, as though unseen hands are tugging, pulling toward a place where light is nothing but a fading memory. The gates of the underworld loom ahead, impossibly vast and carved with symbols that seem to writhe when stared at too long. This is the realm of Ereshkigal, Queen of the Dead, and her monsters are the first to greet those who dare approach. Their eyes are the first thing seen, glowing faintly in the dimness like embers stirred to life. Shapes emerge from the shadows, bodies twisted and unnatural, hybrids of man and beast, forged in the crucible of fear itself. These are no ordinary guards, they are creatures born to enforce the boundaries between the living and the dead, to ensure that once someone passes through those gates, they never leave. Each monster is a testament to Ereshkigal's power, a reflection of her dominion over death. There is the hulking, bull-headed warrior, its hooves echoing like thunder as it paces before the gates. Its breath steams in the cold, and its horns gleam with an otherworldly light, ready to gore any who dare challenge its authority. Its eyes burn with a fierce intelligence, as though it not only enforces but also understands the gravity of its duty. Beside it slithers a serpent-like creature, its scales glimmering faintly with a sickly sheen. Its body coils and uncoils with a grace that belies its size, and its hiss carries the sound of 1,000 whispers, voices of those who have tried to plead their way past it and failed. Its fangs drip with venom said to paralyze not the body but the soul, leaving intruders helpless as they are dragged into the depths. And then there is the beast with the face of a woman, her eyes hollow but her mouth twisted in a cruel smile. Her voice is soft, almost kind, as she beckons the weary traveler closer. But those who fall under her spell are quickly reminded of her true nature as her claws extend, tearing into the very fabric of their existence. She is beauty and terror entwined, a creature meant to lure and destroy. These monsters are not just guards, they are symbols of the underworld's finality. Each one represents an aspect of death, the inevitability, the terror, and the inescapable truth that no one can bargain their way out of its grip. To face them is to confront mortality itself, to feel the weight of life's impermanence pressing down with every breath. But there are stories of those who dared to challenge these beings, drawn by desperation or hubris. One tale speaks of a man, a warrior of unmatched skill, who sought to rescue his beloved from Ereshkigal's domain. He faced the bull-headed guardian first, its sheer size dwarfing him. The clash was brutal, the sound of metal on horn ringing through the cavernous space. Though he fought valiantly, his strikes barely scratched its hide. In the end, it was not strength that overcame the guardian but cunning, as the warrior used the creature's own momentum to topple it. The serpent was next, its body encircling him like a living noose. Its venom dripped dangerously close, and its hiss filled his ears, threatening to drown out his thoughts. But the warrior remained steadfast, driving his blade into the creature's soft underbelly. Its scream was unearthly, echoing long after it fell silent. Finally, he faced the woman-faced beast. Her voice was a balm to his weary soul, and for a moment he faltered, drawn to her beauty and the promise of rest. But as her claws descended, he struck, his blade finding its mark. The victory was hard-won, and though he passed through the gates, it is said he never returned, the weight of the underworld too much for even his strength to bear. The monsters of Ereshkigal's underworld are not mere obstacles. They are echoes of the fears and sorrows that haunt every human heart, amplified in given form. To see them is to see oneself, to confront the darkness within. They are reminders that death is not just an end but a passage, guarded fiercely to ensure it is respected. Their forms may change in the telling. Some speak of winged beasts that blot out the dim light, others of creatures so grotesque they defy description. But their purpose remains the same, to protect the sanctity of the underworld and to serve their queen with unwavering loyalty. They are shadows made flesh, warnings carved into the fabric of existence, and the embodiment of all that waits beyond the veil. Standing before them, the weight of their gaze is unbearable, the silence between their movements deafening. They do not threaten with words or gestures, their very presence is enough to instill a fear that lingers long after they vanish from sight. They are the keepers of a place no one wishes to see, and yet they are impossible to forget. The sky trembles, its once serene expanse darkened by the roiling shadows of an impending storm. A deep rumble grows, not from thunder, but something more primal, a sound that seems to rise from the bones of the earth itself. The air is thick, electric, charged with an energy that whispers of an ancient feud, a clash of forces older than time. And then, piercing the stillness, comes the first hiss, low and menacing, followed by the slither of scales vast enough to reshape the land. Illuyanka, the serpent, emerges. This is no ordinary creature. Its body coils endlessly, each scale shimmering with the iridescence of nightmares. Its eyes burn like twin suns, unblinking and filled with malice. Illuyanka, the great serpent, stands as the embodiment of chaos and defiance, a force that once sought to topple the balance of the cosmos itself. It is said that when this serpent moved, mountains bowed and rivers diverted, as if the earth itself could not bear its presence. Opposing Illuyanka stands the storm god, the master of the skies and bringer of rain. His name is spoken with reverence and fear, a god of strength who commands the heavens with a flick of his wrist. But even gods are not immune to the cunning of chaos. In the first clash between the storm god and Illuyanka, it was not victory that awaited the divine warrior, but defeat. The serpent, with its vast cunning and endless coils, overpowered the god, leaving him beaten and stripped of his might. The storm god retreated, but not in despair. He licked his wounds and gathered his strength, his anger growing like a tempest on the horizon. For the serpent had done more than defeat him, it had humiliated him, claiming the divine weapons that once made him invincible. Illuyanka, swollen with its triumph, grew bolder, tightening its hold over the world. With each passing day, its shadow loomed larger, a constant reminder of the chaos that threatened to engulf all. But the storm god was not one to accept defeat lightly. He bided his time, watching and waiting, his rage simmering beneath a calm exterior. He knew that brute force alone would not bring the serpent to its knees. This battle required wit, a plan that would strike at the very heart of Illuyanka's power. And so, with a cunning rivaling that of the serpent itself, the storm god set his trap. It began with a feast. The god orchestrated a banquet so grand that even the serpent, insatiable in its greed, could not resist. The tables groaned under the weight of food and drink, and the air was filled with the tantalizing aroma of offerings fit for kings and beasts alike. Illuyanka, lured by its own insatiable hunger, arrived, its massive body coiled and poised, ready to devour all that was laid before it. The serpent feasted, unaware of the trap hidden within the bounty. It gorged itself on the god's offerings, its arrogance blinding it to the true danger. And then, when Illuyanka was at its most vulnerable, bloated and sluggish, the storm god struck. Armed with his reclaimed weapons and a fury that could split the heavens, he unleashed his full might upon the serpent. The clash was cataclysmic. The serpent's roars shook the mountains, and the god's lightning illuminated the battlefield like a second sun. Illuyanka fought with the desperation of a cornered beast, its coils lashing out, seeking to crush its foe. But the storm god was relentless, his strikes precise and unyielding. Each blow drove the serpent closer to defeat, each flash of lightning carving away at the chaos that had once seemed insurmountable. And then, with one final, earth-shattering strike, the storm god delivered the killing blow. Illuyanka's body writhed and convulsed, its once mighty form collapsing into the earth it had sought to dominate. The serpent's death was not quiet, it was a cacophony of defiance and despair, a sound that echoed through the heavens and the underworld alike. Yet, even in death, Illuyanka's legacy endured. Its blood seeped into the earth, mingling with the rivers and mountains, a reminder of the chaos that always lingers just beneath the surface. The storm god stood victorious, but his triumph was bittersweet. He had reclaimed his place among the gods, restored balance to the world, but he knew that chaos could never truly be defeated. It was a force as ancient as creation itself, waiting patiently for its next moment to rise. The story of Illuyanka and the storm god is not just a tale of cosmic struggle, it is a reflection of the eternal battle between order and chaos, a dance as old as time. The serpent's defeat was not an end, but a beginning, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there is light, strength, and resilience. And so, the storm abated, the skies cleared, and the earth sighed in relief. But somewhere, in the shadows of memory, the serpent's eyes still burned, a silent promise that chaos would always find a way to return. The temple stood on a hill, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. Its ancient stones, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, seemed to hum with a quiet power. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of earth and the faint aroma of incense lingering from forgotten rituals. And there, in the shadows that stretched long and deep across the land, was the guardian, a creature so immense, so otherworldly, it felt as though it had been carved from the very bones of the earth. The dragon of Arena was no mere beast. Its form shimmered with an ethereal brilliance, scales reflecting light like the surface of a still lake at dawn. Its wings, vast and feathered with veins of gold, spread out to touch both heaven and earth. Eyes as deep and ancient as the stars watched over the sacred temple, unblinking and unwavering. This was not a creature of chaos or destruction, it was a sentinel, a protector, bound by purpose and sacred duty. The dragon was not alone. Whispers of its existence traveled through the hearts of those who sought wisdom and solace, those brave enough, or desperate enough, to ascend the hill. The people of Arena revered the dragon not out of fear but out of awe. It was said to guard knowledge so profound it could reshape destinies, knowledge whispered to be the breath of the gods themselves. Few dared approach, for they knew the cost of unworthy intentions. The dragon's breath could scorch the earth, but it was not anger that drove its flames. Instead, it was a fierce, uncompromising clarity, a truth that burned away falsehoods and pretenses. Those who came seeking power, driven by greed or arrogance, were turned to ash before they could utter their first plea. But those who approached with hearts full of humility, with questions born from genuine longing, would feel the dragon's warmth, not fire, but the gentle heat of a world that cared. Legend spoke of a young seeker, a boy with nothing but a tattered cloak and eyes full of hope. He had climbed the hill in the dead of night, the stars his only guide. The dragon had watched him approach, its great form still as stone, its gaze piercing. The boy, trembling, fell to his knees before the creature and whispered his plea, a simple wish to understand the world, to learn why he felt so small beneath the weight of existence. The dragon's eyes softened, and for the first time in generations, it spoke. Its voice was like the rush of the wind through ancient trees, both vast and intimate. It told the boy stories, not answers, but tales woven with wisdom, stories of gods and mortals, of love and loss, of choices that shaped worlds. The boy listened, enraptured, and as the dawn broke, he left the hill not with power, but with understanding. The dragon's wisdom was not a treasure to hoard, it was a gift to protect. The temple it guarded was more than stone and mortar, it was a symbol of the sacred trust between gods and mortals, a place where the boundaries between the two blurred. The dragon was the keeper of this fragile balance, ensuring that sacred knowledge was never misused, that it remained a force for good in a world so often teetering on the edge of chaos. But even guardians face trials. The story of the Dragon of Arena is incomplete without its greatest challenge, a band of invaders, hungry for conquest, who sought to claim the temple and its secrets. They came with swords and fire, their hearts hardened by greed. As they climbed the hill, the dragon rose, its massive body blocking the temple's entrance. It roared, a sound that shook the heavens and sent the invaders to their knees. Yet, they did not retreat. The battle that followed was swift and devastating. The dragon fought not with rage, but with purpose, its flames carving paths of light through the darkness. The temple stood untouched, its sacred stones glowing faintly as if infused with the dragon's spirit. And when the last of the invaders fell, the dragon returned to its post, its eyes dim with the sorrow of lives lost, but resolute in its duty. The dragon of Arena is more than a myth. It is a reminder of the sacredness of knowledge, of the need to protect what is precious and profound. It teaches that power without wisdom is dangerous, that strength must always be tempered with compassion. Its story is a flame that refuses to be extinguished, a light that continues to guide those brave enough to seek it. The moon hung low, casting a silver glow over the dense forests and craggy hills of an ancient land. The villagers whispered of shadows that moved just beyond the tree line, of creatures whose forms defied comprehension. At first glance, they seemed human, broad shoulders, strong arms, eyes glinting with intelligence. But then, a flick of a tail, a clawed hand, or the sudden flash of wings would reveal the truth: these were not men. There was something else, beings caught between the mortal and the wild, their very existence a mystery woven into the fabric of the world. These hybrids, half human and half beast, were not the work of chance. They were creations, beings born of the gods or shaped by forces too ancient to name. Their presence was not merely feared but revered. They embodied the wild chaos of the natural world and the ordered intellect of humanity, straddling a boundary few dared to cross. There was the Lion Man, his mane flowing like fire, his voice a rumble that echoed in the hearts of those who heard it. He stood as a symbol of raw strength and unyielding authority. To the Hittites, he was both protector and punisher, a being whose wrath could bring cities to their knees, but whose favor could turn the tide of battle. Those who sought his blessing would approach with gifts of meat and wine, laying them at altars adorned with carved images of his fearsome visage. Then there was the serpent woman, her slender form adorned with shimmering scales that caught the light like 1,000 stars. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, seemed to pierce through the very soul. She was the keeper of secrets, a guardian of wisdom hidden deep within the earth. Legend spoke of her guiding lost wanderers, her voice a soft hiss that carried warnings and riddles. But those who dared to deceive her or take her wisdom without permission often found themselves ensnared in her coils, their lives snuffed out as swiftly as a candle in a storm. The eagle-headed men soared high above the mountains, their massive wings slicing through the sky. Their cries were sharp and piercing, a sound that sent shivers down the spines of those who heard it. They were messengers of the gods, carrying the weight of divine commands and celestial truths. Yet they were not always benevolent. Their talons, sharp as knives, could tear through flesh and bone, and their judgment was swift and unrelenting. To see one was both a blessing and a curse, a sign that fate had turned its gaze upon you. But it was not just the creatures themselves that haunted the Hittite imagination, it was what they represented. These hybrids were mirrors of humanity, reflecting both its highest aspirations and its darkest fears. They embodied the struggle between the rational and the primal, the civilized and the wild. To the Hittites, they were reminders of the thin line that separated man from beast, a line that could be crossed with a single misstep. One story spoke of a hunter who ventured too far into forbidden woods, his pride blinding him to the warnings etched into the trees. He stumbled upon a creature unlike any he had ever seen, a woman with the body of a deer, her movements as graceful as the wind through the leaves. She looked at him, her eyes filled with an ancient sorrow, and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of centuries. She warned him to leave, to turn back before it was too late. But he did not listen. Driven by greed and arrogance, he raised his bow. The arrow flew true, but as it struck her, the world seemed to shatter. The hunter fell to his knees, his body twisting and changing until he too bore the mark of the wild. He had crossed the line, and there was no return. These tales were not mere stories, they were warnings, lessons carved into the collective memory of a people who understood the fragility of their place in the world. The hybrids were not to be trifled with, for they carried within them the power of the gods and the fury of nature itself. To encounter one was to face the unknown, to stand on the edge of a precipice and feel the pull of the abyss. Yet, there was also beauty in their existence. The hybrids were more than their fearsome appearances, they were symbols of unity, of the possibility that two opposing forces could come together to create something extraordinary. They reminded the Hittites that humanity was not separate from the natural world, but a part of it, bound by the same laws and subject to the same truths. In the quiet hours of the night, when the firelight flickered and the stars seemed close enough to touch, the elders would tell their stories. They would speak of the horsemen who galloped through the plains, their laughter mingling with the wind, and the fish women who sang songs that lured sailors into the depths. They would describe the wolfmen who ran with the pack, their howls echoing across the valleys, and the bull-headed guardians who stood watch at the gates of sacred temples. These hybrids were not just creatures of myth, they were the embodiment of a world that was both wondrous and terrifying, a world where anything was possible. They were a reminder that the line between man and beast, mortal and divine, was not as clear as it seemed. They were a testament to the power of imagination, to the human need to understand the unknown, to give form to the mysteries that lay just beyond the edge of the firelight. And so, their stories lived on, carried by the winds and whispered through the trees. They were etched into the stones of temples, painted onto the walls of palaces, and sung in the melodies of ancient hymns. They were more than myths, they were a part of the soul of a people, a reflection of their fears, their hopes, and their endless fascination with the world around them. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the mournful howl of a distant wind that seemed to carry whispers. A chill clung to the air, and the villagers huddled close to their fires, their faces pale with unspoken fears. Somewhere beyond the safety of their crude walls, an unseen presence lingered, watching, waiting. It was said that when the Louan spirit stirred, no prayer could shield you, no charm could turn them away. They were chaos incarnate, forces of destruction that swept through the land like a merciless storm. These spirits were not bound by the rules of the mortal world. They moved as shadows, slipping through cracks and crevices, finding their way into places thought safe. A single breath of theirs was enough to bring ruin. Crops withered, livestock fell dead, and once joyful homes turned into tombs of sorrow. Yet, their wrath was not always immediate. Sometimes, they lingered, their presence a slow poison that gnawed at the edges of sanity. The laughter of children would fade, the songs of workers would falter, and an oppressive gloom would settle over everything, as if the very land had surrendered to despair. The Louan spirits were not born of malice alone. They were ancient, older than the stones of the mountains or the waters of the rivers. Some said they were remnants of a time before the gods, when chaos ruled unchecked and the world was a battlefield of raw, unshaped forces. Others whispered that they were the souls of the forsaken, those who had died in anguish or anger, their restless spirits twisted into agents of destruction. Whatever their origin, one thing was certain, they answered to no one and followed no law but their own. One tale spoke of a warrior who dared to challenge them. His name was Arson, a man of great strength and unshakable will. When his village was struck by the spirits, he vowed to end their torment. Armed with a blade blessed by the priests and a heart full of courage, he ventured into the wilderness. For days he wandered, the shadows growing thicker with each step, until he reached a desolate clearing where the spirits were said to dwell. The air was thick with an unnatural cold, and the ground beneath his feet felt lifeless, as if all vitality had been drained from it. Then they came. First, a low, mournful wail that seemed to rise from the very earth. Then, shapes began to form, pale and translucent, their features twisted into expressions of agony and rage. They circled him, their movements fluid and serpentine, their hollow eyes fixed on him with an intensity that chilled his soul. Arson stood his ground, raising his blade as he called out to them. He demanded they leave his village, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his heart. For a moment, the spirits paused, their forms flickering like dying flames. Then, with a deafening roar, they attacked. They moved like a storm, a whirlwind of shadow and despair. Arson fought with all his strength, his blade cutting through the air as he tried to hold them back. But for every spirit he struck down, two more seemed to rise in its place. Their screams filled his ears, their cold touch sapped his strength, and their relentless fury drove him to his knees. In the end, it was not his blade that saved him but his resolve. As the spirits closed in, he plunged his sword into the ground and shouted a prayer to the gods. The earth trembled, and a blinding light erupted from the blade, forcing the spirits to retreat. When the light faded, the clearing was empty, and Arson was alone. He returned to his village a changed man, his once proud spirit now haunted by what he had faced. The spirits had been driven away, but their presence lingered in his mind, a reminder that chaos could never be truly vanquished. The Louan spirits were not always enemies. There were those who sought to bargain with them, to harness their power for their own ends. Shamans and sorcerers would perform rituals to summon them, offering sacrifices in exchange for their aid. But such pacts were dangerous, for the spirits were not easily controlled. They would grant their power, but it came at a cost. Those who called upon them often found themselves consumed by the very forces they sought to wield, their bodies and souls twisted into something unrecognizable. In the annals of history, there are accounts of entire cities brought to ruin by the Louan spirits. One such tale tells of a great king who sought to expand his empire, his ambition driving him to conquer lands that were sacred to the spirits. He ordered the destruction of ancient shrines, dismissing the warnings of his advisors. For a time, his campaign was successful, his armies unstoppable. But then, the spirits struck. A plague swept through his lands, turning his once thriving cities into graveyards. Storms ravaged his crops, and his soldiers deserted him, their minds broken by nightmares they could not escape. The king himself was found dead in his palace, his face frozen in an expression of utter terror. His empire crumbled, and his name was erased from the records, a cautionary tale of hubris and folly. Even in modern times, the stories persist. Travelers speak of places where the air feels heavy and the shadows seem to move on their own. Villagers warn of strange sounds at night, of whispers carried on the wind that speak of doom. And though the world has changed, the fear of the Louan spirits remains. They are a reminder that chaos is never far away, that the forces of destruction and disorder are always waiting, watching, ready to strike. The Louan spirits were not mere myths, they were a force, a presence that could not be ignored. They were a testament to the fragility of order, to the ever-present threat of chaos that lurked at the edges of existence. And though their tales were told in hushed tones, the lessons they carried were clear: respect the balance, honor the old ways, and never, ever forget the power of the unseen. The sea stretched endlessly, dark and foreboding, its surface restless as though something immense stirred beneath. The air carried a heavy stillness, a quiet before a storm that every living thing could feel deep in its bones. Fishermen, once brave enough to venture out, tied their boats to shore with trembling hands, their eyes fixed on the horizon. They knew the stories, passed down in whispers: the sea was not empty, and its depths belonged to Yam, the ancient monster of the waters. Yam was no ordinary beast. The sea monster embodied the untamed power of the ocean, fierce and unyielding, a force as old as creation itself. Its presence was felt in the crashing waves and the sudden, violent tempests that swallowed entire fleets without warning. But Yam did not merely exist in the water, it was the water. Every current, every tide, carried its will, and no one who faced it survived to tell the tale. On land, the storm god Baal stood against this terror. His name was spoken with reverence, his power the hope of humanity. Where Yam was the chaos of the sea, Baal was the fury of the storm, his thunderous voice echoing through the heavens. But even he knew that what lay ahead was no ordinary battle. Yam's wrath had grown unbearable, and the balance of the world was at stake. The confrontation began with a roar that shook the heavens. The sea churned violently, waves rising as high as mountains, crashing down with deafening force. From the depths emerged Yam, its monstrous form more terrible than any nightmare. Its serpentine body twisted and coiled, scales gleaming like obsidian in the dim light. Eyes like molten fire burned with ancient rage, and its jaws, filled with rows of jagged teeth, seemed capable of swallowing the sky itself. Baal stood unyielding, lightning crackling in his hands. He did not flinch as Yam towered before him, its shadow darkening the earth. The air grew heavy with tension, the clash of their powers imminent. Then, with a deafening cry, Yam surged forward, its massive body crashing through the waves like a force of nature. The battle was not just a fight of strength, but of wills. Yam's attacks came like tidal waves, relentless and overwhelming, each strike threatening to drown the world in chaos. Baal countered with thunderous blasts of lightning, the sky splitting open with each strike. The land trembled beneath their fury, the ocean boiling where their powers collided. For every blow Baal landed, Yam retaliated with twice the ferocity. The storm god's lightning illuminated the beast, revealing its true immensity. Yet, Baal's resolve never wavered. His defiance burned brighter than his storms, his will unshaken even as the sea itself seemed to rise against him. The battle raged on, unrelenting and brutal. Baal's strikes seared the air, each bolt of lightning cutting through Yam's monstrous form, but the sea monster would not fall. Its roars echoed like thunder, its massive tail sweeping across the land and shattering mountains. For a moment, it seemed as though even Baal's might was not enough to overcome this ancient force. But Baal was not alone in his struggle. From the heavens, his allies sent him a weapon of unparalleled power. A blade forged from the essence of the storm itself, it gleamed with an energy that seemed to pulse with life. Baal grasped the weapon, its power surging through him, igniting his fury anew. With a cry that shook the heavens, Baal leapt forward, the blade cutting through the chaos like a beacon of hope. He struck with all his might, the weapon finding its mark in Yam's massive body. The sea monster let out a deafening roar, its form writhing as the storm god's power surged through it. The sea itself seemed to recoil, waves retreating as Yam's strength faltered. But Yam was not so easily defeated. With a final, desperate surge, it lashed out, its massive jaws snapping inches from Baal's form. The storm god pressed on, his strikes relentless, his resolve unyielding. Each blow weakened the beast, its roars growing weaker, its massive body beginning to crumble. At last, with one final, thunderous strike, Baal brought the blade down, severing Yam's power from the sea. The monster let out a final, mournful cry before collapsing into the depths, its massive form dissolving into the waters it once ruled. The sea grew calm, the storm subsiding as Baal stood victorious, his figure illuminated by the first rays of sunlight piercing the clouds. The world seemed to hold its breath, the chaos giving way to an eerie stillness. The people who had watched from the shore fell to their knees, their faces wet with tears. They knew they had witnessed something beyond comprehension, a battle that would be etched into the fabric of existence itself. Baal did not celebrate his victory. His face was solemn, his gaze fixed on the sea. He understood the cost of his triumph, the delicate balance that had been preserved, but not without sacrifice. The waters were calm now, but they would always remember the wrath of Yam. And so would Baal. For though the storm god had won, the memory of the battle would linger, a reminder of the eternal struggle between chaos and order, destruction and creation. The wind howled through the desert, carrying with it an ancient tension. A time of great reckoning was near. The earth shook, as if in anticipation, and the skies darkened. The people, gathered in silence, stared into the vast emptiness, feeling something more powerful than nature itself stirring beneath the surface. It was the whisper of old myths, legends passed down from the earliest days, stories of creatures so vast, so terrifying, they could shake the very foundation of existence. In the waters that lapped against the shores of ancient Canaan, the Leviathan lurked, its form a shadow in the depths, an untamable force of chaos. Its scales glimmered like the stars, reflecting the light of 1,000 forgotten gods. Massive, coiled, and powerful, it was a creature of the sea, but not merely a beast of flesh and bone. The Leviathan was the ocean itself, embodying the unpredictable, ever-changing nature of the deep. Those who dared to sail the waters spoke in fearful tones, knowing that to cross its path was to face the raw power of the cosmos. Its jaws could swallow entire ships whole, its roar could stir the very tides. And yet, in the midst of this terror, there was a strange reverence. The Leviathan was not just a creature to fear, it was a symbol. It represented something larger than the world, something beyond moral comprehension. The people who lived by the sea knew its power, but they also recognized that it held sway over the very fabric of existence. It was both destroyer and protector, an unstoppable force that held sway over life and death, creation and destruction. Then, there was Behemoth, the great beast of the land, its form as colossal as mountains themselves. It roamed the ancient plains, its heavy footfalls causing the ground to tremble. Covered in thick fur and with horns that reached toward the sky, Behemoth was a creature born from the land, a living symbol of the earth's strength and endurance. But unlike the Leviathan, Behemoth was not a creature of chaos. It was a beast of order, a guardian of the natural world that balanced the forces of destruction with its raw, grounding power. It was said that Behemoth's very presence could calm the earth itself, taming the wildest storms and restoring peace to the land. And yet, as much as Behemoth was revered, there was an unease surrounding it. It was a reminder of the primal forces of nature, of the untapped potential for chaos that lay beneath the surface of the world. Behemoth stood as both a protector and a warning. For every moment of peace it brought, it also carried the reminder of the earth's overwhelming power, of a force that could never truly be controlled. But the story of these two great beasts, the Leviathan and Behemoth, would not remain confined to the shores of the ancient world. They would find their way into texts, into stories that would span millennia, transforming from mythical creatures into symbols of cosmic struggle. As the centuries passed, the ancient Canaanite tales of these beasts would intertwine with those of the Hebrew Bible, where the Leviathan would come to represent the forces of chaos, and Behemoth, the embodiment of the natural world's raw strength. In the Bible, the Leviathan's fearsome power was no longer just a symbol of the sea's untamed nature, it became the embodiment of evil itself. Its form shifted in these new texts, becoming a creature of darkness, a force to be reckoned with at the end of times. The mythological creature that once dwelled in the deep, a figure to be respected, was now a symbol of all that was terrifying and destructive. In the book of Job, God speaks of the Leviathan as a reminder of his own power, the very creature that only he could control. It was no longer just a beast of the sea, it was a reminder of divine authority over all forces, both seen and unseen. Behemoth, too, changed in these new stories. The great beast of the land, once a protector of the earth, became a symbol of divine strength. But unlike the Leviathan, which had become a force of chaos, Behemoth remained a figure of stability and order. In the Hebrew Bible, it was said that Behemoth would rise at the end of time, in the moment of ultimate reckoning, to stand beside God. It would symbolize the earth's enduring strength, a reminder that even in the face of cosmic destruction, the land would endure. The stories of the Leviathan and Behemoth had been transformed. What had once been creatures of the natural world, beasts that embodied the raw power of sea and earth, became symbols of cosmic struggle. The Leviathan, once a symbol of nature's unpredictability, was now a force of evil to be vanquished. Behemoth, once a symbol of the earth's endurance, was transformed into a force of divine will. The myths that had been told by the people of Canaan had been reshaped, now carrying the weight of generations, passed down and reinterpreted with each retelling. And yet, despite the transformations they underwent, the essence of these creatures remained unchanged. They were still Leviathan and Behemoth, the sea and the earth, chaos and order, symbols of a power greater than humanity, beyond comprehension, forces that shaped the world and would continue to do so long after the last breath was taken. They were reminders that, no matter how much the world changed, no matter how much time passed, there were forces beyond our control, forces that demanded respect. Perhaps it was this understanding, this awe in the face of something so immense, that gave these creatures their lasting power. The Leviathan, the Behemoth, the beasts of the ancient world, they had no need for words. Their power spoke for itself. They were the eternal forces that shaped the world, and they would continue to do so, long after the myths were forgotten, long after the last whisper of their names faded into silence. The ground trembled beneath the weight of his presence. No one saw him approach, they only felt his arrival. A shiver ran through the people, an instinctive fear that crawled up their spines, making their hearts beat faster. He wasn't a figure who needed to announce himself, he was known in the silence between breaths, in the fleeting moment when time stood still. Mot, the god of death, walked where light never reached. His very name carried a heavy weight, a burden that crushed the spirit of anyone who heard it. Mot was not like the gods of the sun or the sky, who held dominion over life and growth. He was the shadow at the edge of existence, waiting patiently for all things to wither and fall. To speak of him was to speak of the end. But Mot wasn't just a name, a distant concept to be whispered in fear. He was real. He had shape, form, he was as tangible as any living creature. He was the embodiment of death itself, but not in the gentle, passing sense that we often imagine. No, Mot was monstrous, a vast, looming figure whose hunger was unending. He stood with an air of finality, his presence suffocating. His face, if one could call it that, was obscured, for to look upon him was to risk losing one's sanity. It was said that his eyes burned with a hunger that never died, an emptiness that swallowed everything in its path. Mot did not simply take life, he consumed it. The land, the animals, the people, everything that lived would eventually fall under his gaze. But he was not to be seen as a force of mere darkness. No, Mot was something more chilling, something with purpose. He was the end of all things, the great equalizer, the one who would one day claim even the gods themselves. His hunger wasn't cruel, nor was it merciful, it simply was. There was no compassion in Mot's realm, no time for sorrow or regret. When death came to call, there was no escape. Legends whispered of Mot's monstrous nature. Some said his body was a storm of decay, where flesh and shadow merged in an unholy union. His limbs were twisted, grotesque, arms that reached out like skeletal hands, drawing all life toward him. His breath was like the dry winds of the desert, harsh and suffocating. But it wasn't just his appearance that struck terror into the hearts of those who knew his name, it was the feeling he left in his wake. People spoke of him as if he was not just a god, but the very force that ensured all things would die. In his presence, there was no room for hope. It was said that Mot could be summoned in the darkest of nights, when the world was asleep, and he would come like a storm, silent, unseen, and yet impossible to ignore. When he arrived, there was a stillness, a pause in the air, as though even the earth itself held its breath. In the quiet that followed, one could almost hear the bones of the earth crack under his weight. The most terrifying thing about Mot was not just his ability to take life. It was his permanence, the finality he represented. To encounter him was to know that there was no returning. Mortals prayed for salvation, but Mot did not answer to prayers. He was above such things. He was not there to take what was given to him, he was there to claim what was his. He did not respect the boundaries of time, he moved through it as he pleased. No matter how much the people feared him, they could never outrun him. You could see him in the eyes of the sick and dying, hear his laughter in the hollow winds that swept through the land. In the deepest caverns, he waited, silently. And when the time was right, he would come, not as a friend, nor as an enemy, but as the inevitable force of nature that he was. There was a strange beauty in Mot's nature, though it was not one that most would ever notice. Perhaps, deep down, those who lived close to death could understand that death itself was not an enemy, but a part of the cycle of life. Mot was not just an end. He was also the one who allowed for the beginning of something else. In his cold, unfeeling way, he was essential. He created space for new life to take root, for fresh stories to begin. But no one ever wanted to think of him that way. He was too terrifying, too monstrous to be seen in any light other than as the enemy. Still, there were whispers that even Mot, in his monstrous form, could be defeated. It was said that the gods of old fought against him in an ancient battle for supremacy, but none could truly overcome him. Mot was death. He could never be destroyed. He was an eternal force, woven into the very fabric of existence. The gods may have been able to delay him, to momentarily push him back into the shadows, but they could not defeat him. In this eternal struggle, Mot stood as the final reminder of life's fragility. There was no fighting him. There was only waiting. There was no victory, only acceptance. His very nature was one that defied the meaning of time itself, an endless loop of endings and beginnings, all circling around the truth that no matter how hard one might try, death was always waiting in the wings, a patient and unforgiving force. Mot's footsteps echoed throughout the realms, long after the battle was done. Though no one could ever truly defeat him, there was something deeply human about the way people continued to resist his presence. They fought against him, not with weapons or prayers, but with the resilience of the living. In the face of death, they lived. In the face of his monstrous reach, they clung to what little life they could, grasping for every precious second before his shadow touched them. And so, though Mot stood as the eternal god of death, his reign was not one of total domination. for in his wake, the living learn to cherish every breath, every heartbeat. They learn to see the beauty in life's fleeting moments, understanding that death, though monstrous and inevitable, was not the end. It was simply the beginning of something else. The roar of a storm shatters the night. Lightning cracks the sky open, and for a moment, the world holds its breath. Deep in the heart of the primordial waters, something stirs. A great form rises, vast and impossible, its serpentine body coiling through the dark abyss. The winds howl in fear, and the earth trembles at the approach of this ancient, incomprehensible being. The beast is not just a creature, it is an embodiment of something much older, much more powerful. It is the embodiment of chaos itself, the very force that formed the world, the serpent of the waters, the dragon of the deep. In the texts of Ugarit, these dragons and serpents were not mere monsters. They were ancient symbols, creatures whose very presence told of a time before time, when the world was nothing but a swirling, formless chaos. These beings were not just guardians of the waters, they were the waters, the primordial oceans that existed before the world took shape. Their bodies were the embodiment of the chaos that preceded creation. And in that chaos, they were both terror and promise. The dragons in the Ugaritic texts did not slither through the earth like the serpents of later mythologies. No, these dragons rose from the depths of the sea, their bodies long and sinuous, their scales gleaming with the power of the unknown. They were the living forces of the oceans, the violent, tumultuous depths that both gave life and swallowed it whole. Their heads reared above the waves like great mountains, their eyes glowing with the wisdom of the ancient world, their jaws able to crush the very stars themselves. They were vast, terrifying, and magnificent all at once. But it wasn't just their size or power that made them so feared, it was their connection to the waters, to the very beginning of all things. These dragons were not born of the earth. They were born of the deep, born of the waters that existed before the sun rose in the sky. They were the harbingers of a time when the world was nothing but chaos, a time before order, before gods, before anything that could be named or known. And in their wake, they carried the power of creation itself. To the people of Ugarit, the dragon was not merely a beast to be hunted or feared. It was a symbol of the unbridled force that had shaped the world, the force that had both given birth to and threatened to destroy it. The serpent, coiled in the depths, was the reminder of how close they were to the primal waters, to the chaos that still lurked just beneath the surface. In their myths, the struggle between the gods and the sea serpent was a reflection of the struggle between order and chaos. It was a battle for control, a battle to ensure that the world would not fall back into the abyss. These dragons were creatures of both destruction and creation. The water from which they came was both life-giving and deadly. Just as the oceans could nourish and sustain, they could also drown and destroy. The serpents that rose from those waters were embodiments of that duality, powerful and dangerous, yet essential to the very fabric of existence. In their battle with the gods, they were both enemies and allies, depending on which side of the storm you found yourself on. In one of the most ancient of Ugaritic texts, the dragon is not a solitary beast. It is part of something much greater. Its struggle is not just against the gods of the earth, but against time itself. The dragon is a force that cannot be easily overcome. It embodies the wild, unpredictable nature of the primordial waters, a nature that even the gods must respect, even if they must fight it. And the struggle is not just for the gods to win. It is for the balance of all things. For without the dragon, without the chaos, there would be no creation. And without creation, there would be no life. It is in the tension between the dragon and the gods that the truth of existence is laid bare. Life is not just about order. Life is about the struggle, about the interplay of forces that sometimes seem to pull in opposite directions. The sea, with its dark, mysterious depths, is not something that can be tamed. It is something that must be understood, respected, and sometimes fought. And even when the gods stand victorious, they know that the sea, and the dragons that rise from it, will always be there, waiting to reclaim what they once had. As you stand on the edge of the shore, looking out into the vast, endless sea, you can almost hear the faint roar of the dragon. You can feel the pull of the water, the eternal ebb and flow that calls you into its depths. And for a moment, you understand the fear and reverence the ancient people felt for these beings, these serpents of the sea. They were not just monsters to be defeated. They were the very essence of the world's beginning, creatures that reminded humanity of its place in the universe, small, fragile, but connected to something far larger, far more ancient than anything they could ever comprehend. And in this understanding, there is both terror and awe. For even in the heart of the storm, in the presence of the dragon, there is a sense of wonder. There is the realization that the world, though fragile, is also beautiful. The serpent, the dragon, is both a monster and a god. It is both the force of destruction and the force of creation. It is the reminder that, though life is fleeting, it is also infinitely powerful, infinitely mysterious. The night is heavy, thick with the weight of forgotten voices. You feel them before you hear them, the whispers of those long gone, brushing against the edges of your mind like a cold wind. In the quiet, you begin to sense the presence of something far older than any living being. These are not ghosts of the past, lingering in faded memories. These are the Rephaim, ancient spirits of the dead, rising from the shadows with a power that chills the very air around you. They are more than the memories of ancestors. They are something monstrous, something that transcends the human understanding of death. The Rephaim were not gentle spirits. They were warriors in their time, titans whose bodies had been laid to rest, but whose souls never fully departed. As they returned from the darkness, they were not soft echoes, but terrifying, imposing forces, beings who carried with them the strength of their past lives, and the horror of what they had become. They did not walk softly. They moved with the weight of death itself, their monstrous attributes a reminder of the power that had once been theirs. To the living, the Rephaim were neither protectors nor comforters. They were ancestral beings who had transformed into something beyond their mortal selves. These spirits, once human, now existed on a different plane. Their bodies were twisted, their features magnified and grotesque. What once had been a simple face was now an expression of terror, eyes wide and unblinking, their mouths hanging open in silent screams. Their hands, once delicate, were now powerful and gnarled, capable of crushing anything in their path. They were no longer the ancestors to honor, they were the beings to fear, for they had crossed a threshold no one was meant to cross. Every time the Rephaim rose, the land trembled. Their very existence defied nature's cycle of life and death. They were beings caught between two worlds, unable to find rest, forever wandering in a state of monstrous form. It was said that they roamed the wilderness, calling out to the living with mournful howls, their voices an eerie echo of the past. They were not just spirits, they were embodiments of a forgotten strength, forgotten rage, and forgotten grief. But what was it that made these spirits so terrifying? The answer lay not in their monstrous forms, but in their very nature. The Rephaim were not only the dead, they were the dead who had been transformed. Death had taken their mortal form, but their essence had remained, unchanged and unyielding. In this state, they were free from the constraints of time and human limitations, yet burdened by an insatiable thirst to be remembered. But their memories were twisted. The living had no way to understand them, no way to comprehend what they had become. Every time a living being encountered a Rephaim, it was as if the veil between the living and the dead had been torn wide open. Those who gazed upon the monstrous forms of these spirits could feel the weight of eternity pressing down on their hearts. The souls of the Rephaim had become a force of nature, wild and unpredictable, tied to an ancient world that no longer existed. They were spirits of the forgotten, beings who had lived before time and had returned to reclaim what they had lost. In the depth of their silence, their fury was almost palpable. You could hear their footsteps before you saw them, slow, heavy steps that seemed to echo through the earth itself. The air grew colder, the ground more barren, and the sky darkened with the weight of their presence. It was as if they carried the very soul of death with them, their monstrous forms casting long shadows that reached across the land. Their breath was like a storm, carrying with it the chill of the grave. When they passed, it was as if the world itself took a deep, mournful breath, the earth quivering under the weight of their presence. For those who were brave enough to stand before them, the experience was one of immense terror and awe. In that moment, it was impossible to deny the power of the Rephaim. They were the dead, yes, but they were also something else, something far more frightening. They were proof that death was not an end, but a transformation. The Rephaim were no longer human, but they had not lost their will to live. They still held on to their desires, their anger, their need for recognition. They sought not just to be remembered, they sought to be feared. It was said that the Rephaim could not be destroyed by mere mortal hands. They were beyond the reach of man's weapons, beyond the power of the gods themselves. The only way to banish them was through rituals that could erase their memory from the earth, but even then, their spirits never truly disappeared. They remained, haunting the edges of the world, waiting for the moment when they would rise again. In the silence after they passed, the air seemed to carry their sorrow. The land, once vibrant and alive, now lay barren, touched by the power of those who had died but never found rest. The Rephaim left behind nothing but the chill of death and the knowledge that the line between life and death was thinner than anyone had ever known. They were not mere spirits, but the echoes of the past, forever chained to the living world by the sheer force of their presence. No one could escape their reach. In the dark corners of the world, in the forgotten places where the sun barely touched, their forms still lurked. The Rephaim had become more than just memories. They had become the embodiment of what happens when the world refuses to let go. The dead may rest, but the Rephaim never would. They would always rise again, with their monstrous forms, with their angry spirits, and with the haunting reminder that death is not the end. It is only the beginning of something far more terrifying. There is a moment in the night when everything feels wrong. The stars flicker like dying embers, and the moon, once a steady beacon in the sky, seems to tremble, casting an eerie glow over the land. The air grows heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness that presses down on your chest. And somewhere, beyond the grasp of the world you know, a great serpent stirs, a serpent older than time itself, an embodiment of chaos so immense it threatens the very fabric of existence. This is Apep, the eternal serpent, and every night he slithers through the dark, ready to wage his eternal war against Ra, the sun god. Apep is not just any serpent. He is the embodiment of chaos, a creature whose very presence turns the world upside down. With each twist of his massive body, the balance of all things shifts, threatening to unravel the order that keeps the universe in place. He is the storm, the darkness, the wild chaos that defies reason. The world was born from chaos, but Apep is the one that wants to destroy it all, to return everything to the void. His hunger is endless, his rage relentless. He waits patiently, silently, in the darkest corners of the cosmos, his coils winding through the void like the inevitable darkness that will one day swallow the light. Each night, as the sun sets and Ra makes his journey across the sky, Apep rises. His massive form is a force of nature, stretching through the darkness like an ancient wave crashing over everything in its path. He is the chaos that lies in the heart of the night, a shadow that seeks to devour the light and drag the world back into the nothingness from which it was born. The battle between Ra and Apep is not just a struggle between two gods, it is the struggle between order and chaos, light and dark, life and death. As the night deepens, Apep slithers through the underworld, his massive body weaving in and out of the shadows, seeking Ra, seeking to destroy the sun. The battle is fierce, each clash sending tremors through the world. Apep strikes with the power of the void itself, his body coiling and twisting with an unnatural speed, his eyes burning with the fire of destruction. But Ra, the god of the sun, is unyielding. His light pierces through the darkness, a beacon of hope and order in a world threatened by the forces of chaos. The struggle between them is relentless, an eternal cycle that repeats night after night. But as the night wears on, it becomes clear that this battle is more than just a fight for survival. It is a fight for meaning itself. Without Ra, the sun would never rise, the world would be plunged into endless night, and all life would wither away. But without Apep, there would be no challenge, no reminder that chaos exists in the very fabric of reality. Without him, there would be no need for Ra's light to shine, no reason for the world to continue turning. The two are inseparable, locked in a dance that will never end, each one defining the other. Ra's light is the hope that keeps the darkness at bay, but the darkness is always there, just out of reach, threatening to consume it all. Apophis is the reminder that nothing lasts forever, that even the brightest light can be swallowed by the void. Every night, as Apophis rises, it feels as though the world itself holds its breath. Will the sun rise again? Will light triumph over darkness? Or will the eternal serpent finally succeed in swallowing the world whole? The struggle takes a toll on both gods. Ra is not invincible. His power wanes with each battle, his light flickering like a candle in the wind. And Apophis, though vast and powerful, cannot seem to escape the pull of Ra's light. He strikes again and again, but each time, he is pushed back, his coils snapping like the teeth of a great beast, unable to truly claim victory. The war between them is a war of attrition, each one wearing down the other, but neither able to fully claim the prize. And yet, the battle continues. It is the struggle that defines existence itself, the eternal push and pull between creation and destruction, between life and death. The sun may rise again tomorrow, and Apophis may retreat into the darkness for another day, but the cycle will repeat. The serpent will return, and Ra will rise to meet him once more, and the world will hold its breath, knowing that, for all the light and hope in the world, the darkness is always just a breath away. There are moments when it seems as though the two gods are no longer separate, no longer fighting one another. In those moments, it is as though they are two sides of the same coin, each one shaping the other, each one giving rise to the other's existence. Ra is the light, but without Apophis, there would be no darkness to cast his rays upon. Apophis is chaos, but without Ra, that chaos would have no form, no direction, no purpose. They are bound together in an eternal dance, one that can never truly end. As you stand in the darkness, you feel the weight of the battle between these two forces, the weight of everything that has ever been and ever will be. You understand, for a moment, that this struggle is not just between gods, it is within us all. We, too, carry the light and the darkness within us, the desire for order and the pull toward chaos. And in that moment, you realize that it is not just Ra and Apophis who fight. It is all of us, struggling against the forces that would consume us, seeking to find meaning and balance in a world that is constantly on the edge of destruction. The night fades, and the sun begins to rise, but the battle is never truly over. For as long as the world exists, the eternal serpent will rise again, and the sun will fight to keep the darkness at bay. And in that fight, we are all part of the struggle. The silence in the Hall of Two Truths was deafening. Shadows clung to the towering columns, their edges flickering in the dim light of torches. At the center of the vast chamber, the scale of Ma'at stood gleaming, its delicate balance a symbol of absolute justice. The air was thick with a sense of finality. This was not a place of second chances, it was the threshold where the fate of souls was decided. And just beyond the scale, lurking in the gloom, was a creature that embodied the terror of judgment itself, Ammit, the devourer of souls. Her form was a grotesque fusion, a living nightmare that defied the boundaries of nature. The head of a crocodile jutted forward, jaws lined with razor-sharp teeth that glinted with menace. Her body, the muscular bulk of a lion, radiated feral power, and her hindquarters, the hulking frame of a hippopotamus, were rooted in sheer, immovable strength. Each part of her was chosen with purpose: crocodile, lion, and hippo, creatures that ruled over death in the Nile, predators with no rivals. Ammit was not merely a monster, she was the final enforcer of divine law. The trembling souls that entered the hall dared not look directly at her. Even her breath, a rasping hiss that echoed like the rustle of dry leaves, seemed to suck the warmth from the air. She waited with patience that felt eternal, her amber eyes fixed on the scale, unblinking and unyielding. She knew her purpose. She had no malice, no hunger for power. But she was relentless. When the scales tipped against a soul, she would act without hesitation, consuming it utterly. In her maw, there was no salvation, no chance of return. A soul devoured by Ammit ceased to exist, erased from the cycle of life and death. The weighing of the heart began. The heart, the vessel of a person's deeds, was placed on one side of the scale. On the other, a single feather, the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and order. It seemed almost laughable that a heart, heavy with the burdens of a lifetime, could ever balance against such a delicate thing. And yet, the feather's weight was absolute, for it carried the weight of universal truth. The first soul stepped forward, shrouded in an almost transparent glow. Fear poured off him like a storm, his heart pounding in his chest as he approached the scale. Thoth, the god of wisdom and scribe of the gods, stood to the side, his ibis-like head tilted with calm detachment. He gestured for the heart to be placed. The man's trembling hands presented his heart. It was small and dark, its surface marred with cracks and shadows. As it settled onto the scale, the feather descended slightly, but the heart sank with unmistakable heaviness. It was not even close. The scale tipped drastically, the weight of deceit, cruelty, and selfishness pulling it down. Ammit stirred. The faint shuffle of her massive body sent a wave of dread through the chamber. The condemned man fell to his knees, wailing incoherent pleas, but it was too late. Ammit's jaws opened, revealing rows of teeth that seemed to glisten with anticipation. Her eyes, devoid of pity, locked onto the man as she approached with deliberate steps. Her jaws closed around the heart first, the seat of his essence. Then, in one horrifying motion, she consumed the rest of him. The man's screams were swallowed with his soul, and then there was silence. No trace of him remained, not even a whisper in the void. He had been unmade. Ammit returned to her place near the scale, unhurried, her duty complete. For her, it was not a matter of cruelty or pleasure, it was simply what had to be done. She was the gatekeeper of annihilation, the end that awaited those who failed to live with honor and truth. Another soul stepped forward, this one trembling just as much as the first. He cast a glance toward the feather, as if willing it to save him. His heart was placed on the scale, and for a moment, it seemed lighter. The feather trembled but held firm. The balance was close. Ammit's gaze sharpened, her body tensing ever so slightly, prepared for the outcome. But the feather did not rise further, and the scale did not tilt toward balance. The heart was still too heavy. Ammit rose again. The soul's cries echoed through the hall as she moved with purpose. There was no room for mercy here, no second chances. The feather of Ma'at had spoken, and Ammit carried out its verdict with ruthless efficiency. The soul vanished, devoured by the monstrous enforcer, its essence fading into the void. Yet, for all the terror she inspired, there was something in Ammit that was strangely noble. She was not a mindless beast, nor a bringer of chaos. She was order incarnate, the final line between the moral and the immoral, the worthy and the unworthy. She did not choose who to consume, she simply acted on the truths revealed by the scale. In her ferocity, there was justice. In her monstrous form, there was balance. When a soul finally balanced the scale, when a heart, pure and unburdened, rose to meet the feather, Ammit remained motionless. She did not lunge or devour. Her eyes, glowing faintly in the torchlight, seemed almost to soften, as if acknowledging the rare triumph of a life well lived. In those moments, she was not needed, her terrifying power held in abeyance. The righteous soul would pass into the afterlife, into eternal peace, and Ammit would wait again for the next trial. And so, the cycle continued, night after night, heart after heart. Some were spared, others erased, but Ammit's role never changed. She was not the judge, nor the executioner. She was something beyond both, a force of nature, a reminder that every choice, every action, carried a weight that could not be ignored. Even now, as her hulking form looms near the scale, she waits. She always waits. The hearts will keep coming, and so will the verdicts. Ammit is timeless, unyielding, her purpose as unshakable as the stars above. She is the last thing many souls will ever see, and for those who falter under the weight of their own deeds, she is the end of everything. Beneath the scorching sun of ancient Egypt, amidst the sands that whispered stories of gods and pharaohs, a peculiar figure emerged in the art of the ancients. It was neither lion nor serpent, neither real nor fully imagined. Its form bent the rules of nature, defying logic yet commanding reverence. Its long, sinuous neck coiled with a grace too fluid for a predator, while its body carried the sinewy strength of a wild beast. This was the serpopard, a creature born not of flesh but of symbolism, mystery, and fear. The serpopard was not just a strange figure etched into stone or painted on ivory palettes. It was a force, a guardian, a riddle that refused to be solved. Its serpentine neck suggested cunning, the kind of intelligence that waits, watching from the shadows, until the moment to strike is undeniable. Yet its feline body was pure power, coiled muscle ready to spring, claws that could shred through defenses with terrifying precision. Together, the parts formed a creature that seemed almost too dangerous to exist, and perhaps that was the point. On the Narmer palette, one of the most iconic artifacts of early Egyptian art, two serpopards are locked in a dance of conflict and restraint. Their necks twist and intertwine, their heads facing outward, their fangs bared. The tension in their posture is almost unbearable, as though the slightest shift might shatter the fragile balance they hold. Surrounding them, figures of men stand stiff and resolute, attempting to control these beasts with ropes, but their efforts seem futile. The serpopards are untamed chaos, a living reminder that nature is never truly subdued. What did they mean, these enigmatic beings with their hybrid forms? Were they protectors or destroyers? The truth is as elusive as the creature itself. To some, the serpopard was a symbol of cosmic forces at odds, order battling chaos, the eternal struggle that defined Egyptian mythology. To others, it was a guardian, a being whose ferocity could shield sacred spaces from desecration. And yet, its very form suggested rebellion, a disregard for boundaries and classifications. It was neither one thing nor the other, but a creature of in-betweens, thriving in the spaces where definitions blur. But the serpopard was not content to remain confined to artistic representation. Its essence bled into the stories told in whispers under the moonlit skies. It was said that the serpopard could slip between the realms of the seen and unseen, its movements silent as shadows. Hunters spoke of glimpsing a sinuous neck weaving through the reeds near the Nile, only to vanish as if it had never been there. Others claimed to hear its low, guttural growl in the dead of night, a sound that set every hair on edge and sent even the bravest running. There were tales, too, of those who sought to harness the power of the serpopard. Priests and magicians, desperate to control the uncontrollable, would etch its likeness onto amulets, hoping to capture a fraction of its might. But such attempts were never without risk. To invoke the serpopard was to invite its dual nature into one's life, the promise of protection tempered by the threat of untamed destruction. Some who dared to summon its spirit found themselves haunted by its gaze, a reminder that true power could never be fully contained. The serpopard was more than just a creature, it was a paradox given form. Its body spoke of the natural world, yet its existence defied it. It was at once predator and protector, chaos and control, a thing of the past that lingered in the present. And perhaps that was why it endured. In its twisted neck and powerful limbs, people saw not just an animal, but a reflection of their own struggles and contradictions. Even now, standing before the carvings where the serpopard coils, its gaze feels alive. There is something in its eyes, something ancient, something knowing. It is a reminder of the wildness that lies just beneath the surface, the part of us that cannot be tamed, no matter how hard we try. The serpopard is a warning and a challenge, to respect the forces we do not understand, to embrace the mysteries we cannot solve, and to remember that even in the heart of civilization, the wild still waits. Under the blazing Egyptian sun, a massive figure looms in the desert, ancient and eternal. Its eyes, carved with an intensity that time cannot erode, seem to watch everything and nothing at once. The air around it feels heavier, charged with something unspoken. This is no ordinary statue. It is the Sphinx, and its presence stirs something deep within those who stand before it. Is it a protector, shielding sacred secrets, or a beast waiting in silence, its intentions forever unreadable? The Sphinx is both beautiful and terrifying, its form a blend of human wisdom and animal strength. Its body, low to the ground like a lion in midstalk, suggests power ready to spring at a moment's notice. The human face, calm and unyielding, speaks of intellect, a mind sharp enough to solve riddles or outwit gods. Together, these elements create a creature that is not quite one thing or the other, but something greater, something far beyond comprehension. Legends say that the Sphinx has always been here, a silent guardian standing watch over the shifting sands and ancient monuments. Travelers have whispered tales of its gaze, how it seems to follow you, no matter where you stand. It doesn't move, but its presence feels alive, like a predator watching its prey from the shadows. There is no escape from its attention, no place to hide. But there is a question in that gaze, a challenge that lies just beneath the surface. The Sphinx is not content to merely observe. It demands something, an answer, an offering, an acknowledgement of its power. Those who cannot meet its challenge are said to feel the weight of its disapproval, a heaviness that presses down on their souls long after they have walked away. It is said that the Sphinx does not forgive weakness, and its silence can be as cruel as any spoken curse. Yet, for all its ferocity, there is another side to the Sphinx, one that is harder to see but no less real. Its human face speaks of wisdom, of a being that understands the mysteries of life and death, of the heavens and the earth. In some stories, the Sphinx is a protector, a guardian of sacred truths too powerful for ordinary mortals to hold. It stands as a barrier, keeping the unworthy at bay and ensuring that only the brave, the clever, or the pure of heart may pass. But protection and destruction are two sides of the same coin, and the Sphinx embodies them both. Its claws, capable of shredding flesh, also dig deep into the sand, anchoring it firmly to the earth. Its roar, when it comes, is said to shake the very ground, scattering enemies and reminding all who hear it that some forces cannot be tamed. Yet it is silent most of the time, its voice reserved for moments of great importance. This duality, this blending of opposites, is what makes the Sphinx so compelling, and so dangerous. The stories of the Sphinx are as varied as the stars in the sky. Some speak of a creature that poses riddles, testing the intelligence of those who dare to approach. Failure, they say, is met with swift and merciless death. Success, on the other hand, earns not just survival but a kind of respect, a bond forged in the fire of challenge. Others tell of a Sphinx that guards treasures, its patience infinite as it waits for the one worthy enough to claim them. And there are those who say the Sphinx holds no allegiance to gods or men, that it serves only itself, a being driven by motives no one can understand. What is the Sphinx, truly? It is a question that has haunted humanity for millennia, a riddle with no answer, or perhaps too many answers. To some, it is a symbol of balance, a reminder that strength and wisdom must go hand in hand. To others, it is a warning, a testament to the dangers of arrogance and the futility of trying to control what cannot be controlled. And to still others, it is a guide, a being that challenges us to look beyond the surface, to see the complexity in all things. As the sun sets over the desert, casting long shadows across the sand, the Sphinx seems to come alive in a different way. Its eyes, catching the fading light, seem to glow with an inner fire. Its form, both human and beast, becomes a silhouette against the burning sky, a reminder of its eternal presence. In that moment, standing before it, you cannot help but feel small, insignificant in the face of something so vast and unknowable. Yet there is also a sense of connection, a feeling that the Sphinx, in its own mysterious way, understands you better than you understand yourself. The Sphinx is not just a creature of stone and legend. It is an idea, a force that lives in the hearts and minds of those who encounter it. It is the questions we fear to ask, the answers we are not ready to hear. It is the challenge that pushes us to grow, the mystery that keeps us searching. And though we may never fully understand it, we cannot look away. The Sphinx is eternal, and its presence will haunt us, inspire us, and challenge us for as long as we dare to dream. Under the faint light of the moon, the jungle feels alive with an unnerving energy. Somewhere in the shadows, a presence waits, restless, primal, unrelenting. The air grows thick, heavy with the weight of something ancient and untamed. Then comes the sound, low at first, like a distant rumble. It rises into a guttural roar, shaking the trees, reverberating in the marrow of those who dare tread too close. It is Babi, the ferocious baboon god, a force that embodies chaos and unbridled ferocity, a being whose presence turns fear into something tangible. Babi is no gentle guardian of the wild. He is raw power personified, a god whose very name conjures images of sharp fangs and flashing eyes, of unyielding dominance over all who cross his path. His figure is both familiar and alien, a baboon, yet something more. His fur seems to bristle with an energy that crackles like fire, and his stance is a challenge to the universe itself. In his gaze lies a feral intelligence, a mind that does not hesitate, does not forgive. To the ancient Egyptians, Babi was not merely an animal spirit. He was chaos walking on four legs, a symbol of unrestrained aggression and primal force. They whispered his name in both reverence and dread, knowing that he existed on the edge of order, ready to tear it apart if provoked. His ferocity was legend, his appetite insatiable. They believed he fed on the entrails of the wicked, his hunger as endless as the night sky. The stories tell of Babi's role in the underworld, where his savagery held dominion over the guilty. As the souls of the dead stood before judgment, trembling under the weight of their sins, Babi waited in the shadows, his teeth bared, his growls low and menacing. He was the executioner, the devourer of those deemed unworthy, and his presence alone could unravel even the bravest spirits. The wicked knew that to fail in the scales of Ma'at meant facing him, his teeth, his claws, his endless hunger. But Babi was not a mindless beast. In his ferocity was a strange kind of order, a reflection of the natural world's darker truths. He represented the chaos that balanced creation, the destruction that made way for renewal. His strength was a warning, his violence a reminder that life itself could be ruthless. To invoke Babi was to acknowledge the wildness within, the part of every being that could rage and fight and destroy. His connection to the baboon was no accident. Baboons, with their sharp fangs and fierce social hierarchies, are creatures of contrast. They can be playful, even nurturing, yet in an instant, they can become a whirlwind of teeth and claws. Babi was this duality taken to its extreme, a being who reveled in the raw, unfiltered essence of life. He was both a reflection of the natural world's brutality and a force that transcended it, a god who stood unflinching in the face of chaos. In some tales, Babi's power extended to the physical world. He was said to control the raging waters, his roar able to summon storms that tore through the land. His anger was the earthquake, the avalanche, the sudden strike of lightning that split the sky. Yet, for all his ferocity, there was a strange beauty to him, a magnetism that drew people even as it terrified them. To look upon Babi was to see the raw, unpolished truth of existence, the struggle, the fight, the fire that burns in all living things. The priests who worshipped Babi knew of his unyielding nature, and they approached him with care. They offered him prayers and sacrifices, seeking his favor not out of love, but out of a deep respect for his power. They understood that Babi was not a god to be tamed or pacified. He was a force to be acknowledged, a reminder that life was as much about survival as it was about growth. To honor Babi was to honor the strength it takes to endure, the will to fight for one's place in the world. Even now, the image of Babi lingers in the collective imagination, a symbol of the untamed and the unstoppable. His spirit lives on in the untamed wilds, in the roar of a storm, in the fire that burns in the hearts of those who refuse to back down. He is chaos, yes, but he is also resilience, a testament to the power that comes from embracing one's primal instincts. In the stillness of the night, when the shadows seem to stretch farther than they should and the air feels thick with something unseen, it is said that Babi's spirit stirs. He is a reminder that chaos is never far away, that strength lies in the willingness to confront it head-on. And though his ferocity may strike fear into the hearts of mortals, it also inspires a strange kind of awe, a recognition of the raw, untamed energy that pulses through the universe and within us all. In the dim, flickering light of ancient fires, stories were born. The crackling flames illuminated faces marked by awe and terror as the elders spoke in hushed tones, weaving tales that echoed through the ages. These were not just stories, they were warnings, lessons, and visions of what lay beyond the veil of the known world. The creatures that haunted these myths were not mere fantasies. They were reflections of something deeper, a shared understanding of the world's dangers and mysteries, drawn from the heart of the ancient Near East. In the hearts of these mythologies, a common thread pulses, an archetype that links them together, stretching across cultures and borders. A monstrous shape-shifting force, sometimes with human traits, sometimes with animal characteristics, is always present, lurking just beyond the reach of mortal understanding. These monsters were more than just beasts, they were metaphors for chaos, destruction, and the unknown. In a world where nature and fate seemed to rule with an unforgiving hand, these figures served as constant reminders of how fragile life was, and how easily the order of things could fall apart. The terror these creatures inspired was not random, it was shaped by the very environment and the hardships of ancient life. The storms that ravaged the land, the wild animals that stalked the fringes of civilization, and the terrifying unknowns of the vast deserts and seas, all came together to form the monsters that filled the collective imagination. Whether it was the fearsome serpents of Mesopotamian lore, the unstoppable gods of destruction, or the shadowy figures that lurked in the underworld, one theme always emerged: balance. These monsters represented the delicate equilibrium between life and death, creation and destruction. They were forces of nature, often gods in their own right, whose only purpose seemed to be to test the limits of human endurance. There was, perhaps, no more terrifying figure in these mythologies than the monster that embodied chaos itself. These creatures did not abide by the rules of society or the gods. They were unchained, unrelenting, and without mercy. The creatures of the sea, the terrifying serpents and dragons that rose from the depths, were harbingers of destruction. They came from the primordial waters, representing the untamable force of nature that could destroy everything in its path. In their wake, civilizations crumbled, and the people were left to grapple with the mystery of what lay beneath the surface of their world. Then there were the monsters that inhabited the shadows, creatures born from the darkness of the human soul. They were beasts that fed on fear, whose hunger could only be satisfied by the terror of those they tormented. The demons and spirits of the underworld were not just punishers of the dead, they were forces that threatened to devour the very essence of the living. In ancient Egyptian lore, the terrifying figure of Ammit, the devourer of souls, stood at the crossroads of life and death, waiting to feast on the hearts of those who were deemed unworthy. She was the embodiment of judgment, her insatiable hunger serving as a stark reminder that no one was beyond the reach of fate's cold hand. But even in the face of such monstrous figures, there was always a hero, someone who stood tall against the oncoming storm. The struggle between order and chaos, between the gods and the monsters, played out in the epic battles of myth. The gods, such as the mighty storm god Baal, took up arms against the monstrous forces of the deep. The battle between Baal and the sea monster Yam was not just a contest of strength, but a cosmic clash that mirrored the struggle between the forces of creation and destruction. Every myth told the story of this constant battle, this cycle of rising and falling, of hope and despair. The same themes appear across cultures: Baal's struggle in the Levant, the Egyptian battles against the serpent Apep, the Mesopotamian struggle against Tiamat, and the Canaanite myths that speak of chaos being overcome by the forces of order. These archetypes were universal. They told the same story, that monsters were not just external threats to be fought, but internal forces that lived within each soul. The struggles the heroes faced were reflections of the trials each person must endure to survive in a world that could be as cruel as it was beautiful. Each culture added its own twist to these shared themes, bringing them to life with unique faces, names, and symbols. But at their core, these creatures represented something that transcended culture. They were the primal fears that echoed within the human heart, the nightmares that visited in the dark hours of the night. They were the forces we could not control, the mysteries we could not explain. And yet, even as they sought to destroy, they also taught. They warned against hubris, against the belief that humanity could ever truly conquer nature, fate, or the gods. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of these monstrous figures is their duality. They are both villains and teachers, destroyers and creators. In the midst of their chaos, they bring the lesson that destruction is necessary for creation. Life cannot exist without death, and order cannot be maintained without moments of upheaval. It is a theme that resonates across the ages, a reminder that the monstrous forces that seem to threaten our world are often just as integral to it as the forces of order. The archetypes of the Near East, with their terrifying monsters and divine heroes, serve as a map of human experience, of the darkness we must confront within and without. Whether through the howls of a distant storm or the whispered threats of a shadowy figure, these ancient stories speak to something universal. They tell us that the struggle between light and dark, order and chaos, is as old as time itself. And perhaps, in the end, it is the monsters we fear most that teach us the most about who we are and who we can become. The desert wind blows across the vast, sun-drenched plains, stirring the ancient dust that has settled for centuries. Beneath that heat, and the shadows of towering ruins and the echoes of forgotten voices, lurk ancient monsters, creatures born not from the earth, but from the very soul of Persia itself. These monsters were not merely beasts to be fought. They were reflections of the eternal struggle between light and dark, good and evil. They were forces that haunted the edges of every story, every ritual, and every prayer. To the people of ancient Persia, the monsters were not just legends, they were very real. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, a chilling tale began to take shape. The Achaemenid Empire, vast and mighty, was once a beacon of civilization that spanned across lands and peoples. Yet, even in the midst of its glory, a dark shadow stretched across its borders. These were not the invaders or the armies that threatened the empire's peace. They were the hidden forces, the demons that crept out of the deep recesses of the human heart, waiting to destroy all that was good. In the heart of this empire, Zoroastrianism stood as the guiding light, its teachings shaping the very foundation of Persian society. The struggle between Ahura Mazda, the god of wisdom, and Ingramenyu, the spirit of evil, was more than a cosmic battle, it was a fight that played out in the very souls of men. This battle between light and darkness manifested in the form of monstrous beings, twisted creatures that were not only dangerous but deeply symbolic. They embodied everything that was wrong in the world: chaos, destruction, and corruption. The Persian monsters were not simple beasts. They were dark mirrors, reflecting the worst parts of the human condition. Ingramenyu's legions, known as the Devas, were the ultimate manifestation of evil. They were not mere creatures to be slain, but embodiments of every sinful impulse, every action that disrupted the harmony of the world. In Zoroastrian demonology, the Devas were the dark reflections of the divine spirits, twisted by greed, jealousy, and malice. Their very presence was a warning, a sign of what could happen when the balance between order and chaos tipped too far. But even more terrifying were the unique, shape-shifting creatures that lurked in the underworld, creatures that appeared in different forms and symbols throughout Persian mythology. Some took the shape of monstrous serpents, their scales as hard as iron, their eyes burning with hatred. These serpents were not just animals, they were agents of Ingramenyu, sent to devour the world's light and life. They wrapped around the very heart of the earth, suffocating it in darkness. In the myths, they were often shown battling the divine forces of good, but in the end, their evil always led to their own destruction. They were symbolic of the cycle of evil, how, in the end, it always consumes itself. Other creatures, more subtle and insidious, took the form of shadows. They whispered in the dark, crept into the dreams of those who dared sleep, and wrapped their fingers around the hearts of the innocent. These creatures did not rely on brute force to spread chaos, they used the mind. They were the doubts, the fears, and the insecurities that whispered to the human soul, convincing it to turn against itself. They were the serpents of the mind, who slowly poisoned the spirit. The most terrifying aspect of these monsters, though, was that they were not outside of humanity. They lived within every person. Zoroastrianism taught that each individual had the choice to fight against the devas within themselves, to choose good over evil, light over darkness. But the battle was never easy. The forces of evil were always there, lurking, waiting for a moment of weakness to slip in and take control. The Persian gods and heroes, however, were not helpless in the face of these monsters. They were champions of the light, wielding their swords and wisdom against the devas and their monstrous minions. The legendary heroes, like the great Rostam, embodied the strength to fight these inner and outer battles. They did not see these monsters as mere beasts to slay, they saw them as part of a greater cosmic struggle that spanned the universe and reached into the very soul of humanity. Each victory over a monster was not just a physical triumph, it was a spiritual one. In Persian mythology, these monsters were not just forces to be fought, they were teachers. They reminded humanity of the fragility of the world, of how quickly light could be consumed by darkness, how easily peace could turn into chaos. But they also served as a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. The battle against evil was eternal, but it was not hopeless. There was always the possibility for redemption, for the defeat of darkness. Even in the darkest hours, there was always the hope that the light would rise again. And yet, the very fact that these monsters existed in Persian mythology tells a deeper story. It speaks to the ancient fears and struggles of humanity, to the awareness that evil is not just something outside of us, it is something within. We are all haunted by the same forces that these monsters represent. The struggle between good and evil, light and dark, is not confined to the pages of ancient texts. It is a daily battle, one that shapes who we are and who we will become. The monsters of Persian mythology, terrifying as they are a reflection of this struggle. As the sun sets behind the mountains, the desert once again falls silent. The stories, like the winds, continue to whisper through the ages. The monsters of the Persian world, beasts of shadow, serpents of chaos, continue to haunt the edges of our collective memory, reminding us that the fight against darkness is never truly over. And that in every shadow, there is a spark of light, waiting to burn away the fear. The walls of the ancient temples stood tall, weathered by time, but still speaking a language of their own, one of power, fear, and forgotten histories. Among the intricate carvings and intricate patterns, a darker story emerged. It wasn't just the kings, gods, and warriors who captured the imagination of these people. No, it was the beasts. The monsters that crawled from the depths of chaos, beasts that twisted the very essence of the world and created fear in the hearts of those who encountered them. In the kingdoms of Elam and Assyria, these creatures were not mere figments of myth, they were representations of a truth much deeper. In Elam, a land of shifting winds and forgotten rivers, there existed a world where the line between the mortal and the divine was often blurred. Here, the monsters were more than just symbolic threats. They were warnings, creatures born from the very forces that threatened to break the world apart. They represented an unstable chaos that lurked behind the order of the cosmos, an unrelenting force of destruction that could erupt at any moment. The Elamites knew that their gods were strong, but they also knew that strength alone could not protect them from the darkness. In Assyria, the landscape was no less haunting. The vast desert plains, the towering mountains, and the scorched earth beneath the boots of warriors created a backdrop where monsters seemed almost natural, emerging from the cracks in the earth and the night sky. But these creatures were not just random. They were forged by a kingdom that lived on the edge of brutality. The Assyrians, known for their fearsome warriors, believed that to truly understand the world, they had to confront its most primal aspects, the untamed beasts of destruction, the ones that tore through the fabric of the divine order. In both of these smaller kingdoms, beasts took many forms. Some were familiar, resembling the creatures of nature. Others were monstrous hybrids, strange creatures that blended the features of multiple animals or even gods, creating beings that were unnatural in the most unsettling ways. These beasts were not just imagined to frighten children or entertain crowds. They were designed to embody something much larger. They were physical representations of the disorder that could arise from the ever-present chaos in the world. One of the most disturbing of these was the Assyrian Lamassu. A creature with the body of a bull, the wings of an eagle, and the head of a man, it was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Its very presence was meant to convey the power and control of the Assyrian Empire, a reminder to all who dared to oppose them that there was no escape from their reach. These beings were not just guardians of palaces or thresholds, they were agents of a force that would crush anything standing in its way. They carried a message: chaos would be tamed, but only through force and domination. Then there were the beasts in Elamite mythology. Some were more subtle, hiding in the shadows, while others took on more abstract forms. A serpent with the face of a man, for example, was not just a creature of evil, it was a symbol of the dual nature of creation. It represented both the potential for life and the destructive capacity of the universe. This serpent wasn't merely a force of chaos, it was the embodiment of the tension between order and disorder, and the constant struggle that humanity had to face. But the most terrifying of these beasts were the ones that were born out of nightmares, like the Elamite dragon-like creatures, whose bodies twisted in ways that no natural being should. These dragons, with their fiery eyes and sharp claws, were creatures of pure chaos, symbolizing the unpredictable forces of nature and the universe. The Elamites, whose lands were sometimes ravaged by floods and earthquakes, would have understood these beasts as symbols of nature's uncontrollable rage. They were reminders that even the most orderly kingdoms could be shattered in an instant by forces far beyond human comprehension. As the ancient stories went, these monsters were often the result of divine conflicts, gods battling for control of the cosmos. In these myths, the monsters were the weapons of the gods, or sometimes, they were the children of the gods themselves. Their nature, wild and untamed, mirrored the very violence of the struggles between the divine forces. Whether in Elam or Assyria, the beasts represented the raw power of the world, unstoppable, unpredictable, and often destructive. Yet, these monsters weren't purely evil in the way one might expect. They weren't simply the enemies of mankind to be defeated in battle. They were complex. In a way, they were necessary. The chaotic beasts of Assyria and Elam were the eternal reminders of the fragility of life, the constant threat of destruction lurking in the shadows. They were, paradoxically, what kept the people grounded in the knowledge that peace was never permanent, that order could always break down, that no one was ever truly safe. These monsters reflected the tension of the world itself, where civilization, no matter how powerful, was always one step away from falling into chaos. It wasn't just the gods who fought for control of the earth. It was the people too. The gods and their monstrous creations were reflections of the human struggle to maintain order, to make sense of the chaos that constantly threatened to engulf everything. The kingdom of Elam, with its strange creatures and mysterious deities, was no different. Its people knew that to exist in such a harsh world required a constant, sometimes brutal, effort. The beasts that populated their stories were more than simple enemies, they were part of the world's larger structure, showing how fragility and strength, destruction and creation, were forever intertwined. The terrifying creatures of Assyria and Elam weren't just stories, they were deeply embedded in the hearts of those who lived there. They were a part of their very understanding of the world, living as symbols of the constant threat of chaos that could destroy their lives. These monsters were everywhere, in the murals on palace walls, in the songs sung by the firelight, in the thoughts of rulers who, despite their might, knew they could never fully escape the shadow of these beasts. As the sun set over the ancient cities, the howls of wild creatures seemed to echo across the land, reminding all who lived there that the battle between order and chaos was an eternal one. It was a struggle that never ceased, one that would continue long after the kingdoms of Elam and Assyria faded into dust. And in the silence that followed the storms, the monsters, those symbols of the world's most terrifying forces, remained, forever etched into the hearts of the people. Under the relentless sun of the ancient Mesopotamian world, a shadow looms, a figure that embodies both the harshness of the desert and the silent watchfulness of those who stand guard at the thresholds of life and death. The Scorpion Men, with their fierce, otherworldly presence, were not merely creatures of myth. They were protectors, gatekeepers to secrets that humanity could not bear to understand, nor could they be allowed to enter without consequence. These beings, half human, half scorpion, were not just figures of terror, but were woven into the fabric of ancient Akkadian society as symbols of power, mystery, and the fragility of the world. To stand before them was to face the unknowable. Their eyes, glowing with an intensity that seemed to burn with the weight of ancient wisdom, could pierce the very soul. Their human torsos blended grotesquely into the scorpion's tail, a stark reminder that no man, no matter how mighty, could escape the sting of death. But it was not just death they guarded, it was the very borders of existence, where the world of men met the unknown, where the real and the unreal intertwined. They were the sentinels of thresholds, and in their eyes, the cost of crossing that line was clear. Only those prepared to face the consequences of uncovering forbidden knowledge could hope to pass. The Scorpion Men stood watch at the gates of the divine, where mortals dared not tread. In Akkadian lore, the gods themselves were often shrouded in secrets too vast for mortal minds to grasp. And it was the scorpion men's sacred duty to protect these truths, no matter the cost. Each movement of their tails was a warning: step too close, and you would pay the price. They were not cruel, but they were merciless. In their presence, the air would grow thick with the unspoken understanding that the world beyond the gates was one that could swallow you whole. In one of the most famous stories, the scorpion men stood guard before the gates that led to the realm of the gods. Their role was simple, yet terrifying. They asked only one question of those who wished to pass: were you ready to face the terrible, untold mysteries that lay beyond? The moment you hesitated, even for an instant, was enough to seal your fate. To falter before them was to remain forever on the outside, locked in the realm of the living, away from the divine knowledge that lay beyond. But for those who were brave enough, or foolish enough, to answer their challenge, the stakes were much higher. One wrong move, one slip of the tongue, and you would be struck down in an instant, your body writhing in pain as the scorpion men's deadly sting sealed your fate. For it was not only death they administered, it was judgment. Those who passed the threshold were not merely entering a new world, they were confronting themselves, their deepest fears, and their most hidden desires. There was no mercy in their judgment. They were the silent executioners of truth, reminding all who stood before them that some knowledge is not meant to be known. That there are places in the world, and in the heart, that no man should enter without paying the price. To witness the scorpion men was to see the abyss staring back at you. Their existence was a terrifying paradox. They were guardians of both the divine and the monstrous, keepers of both sacred secrets and dreadful consequences. And in the silence between their steps, there lingered a terrifying question: what lies beyond the threshold? What price are we willing to pay to uncover the mysteries that no mortal should dare to touch? There was a strange sort of sadness that hung in the air as the scorpion men moved about their task. Theirs was not a life filled with joy or contentment, for they were bound to their eternal watch. Each day, they stood vigilant, gazing upon the world, knowing that their existence was a necessary cruelty. They were both part of this world and yet entirely apart from it. The world of the living was too fragile for their truth, too delicate to bear the weight of the divine. They were cursed with knowledge, cursed to guard that which was never meant to be seen. In their isolation, they became creatures of myth, legends told around firelight to warn children to stay within the safety of their homes, far from the gates that might open to reveal the unimaginable. But even in their silence, the scorpion men carried an undeniable presence. In every corner of Akkadian life, their symbolism was present. Their image adorned the entrances of temples, etched into the stone walls of palaces, carved into the hearts of idols. They were more than just myth, they were a representation of the very essence of life's boundaries. They stood as the ultimate reminder that there is always something just beyond reach, something that must never be touched, no matter how much the human heart yearns to understand. It is said that those who dared to pass beyond their watch never returned the same. For the knowledge they sought was too great, too vast for human minds. Some were driven mad by the sheer weight of it, others vanished into the desert, their minds shattered by the experience. The scorpion men's role was clear: not to stop the curious, but to ensure that the cost of curiosity was understood. They did not care for your motives or your desires. The rules were simple. Cross the threshold, and you accepted whatever awaited on the other side. But still, the stories endured. The myths continued to live on, carried by those who whispered of the scorpion men, speaking of their power and their justice in hushed tones. For to speak of them aloud, to truly understand the significance of what they guarded, was to confront the truth that there are forces in this world too great for any man or woman to face. There are secrets too terrible to uncover. And those who sought them, no matter how pure their intentions, would find themselves lost in a world of their own making, tangled in webs of fear and knowledge, watched by the silent, unblinking eyes of the scorpion men. A flickering flame cast its warm glow against the walls of the ancient temple, the air thick with incense. Beneath the sacred canopy, an elder raised his arms high, chanting words that seemed to vibrate in the very earth beneath them. The ground trembled, a low hum rising from the dark corners of the room. The people stood, breathless, hearts pounding. They were not simply witnessing a ceremony, they were standing at the precipice of something far older and far darker than they could ever understand. In that moment, the line between the living and the dead blurred, and they knew, deep within their bones, that monsters walked among them. Monsters were not always the terrifying creatures that lurked in the shadows. They could be summoned, their forms taking shape in the smoke of incense and the rhythm of drums. But just as easily, they could be warded off, driven away with sacred words and the right rituals. In the ancient world, to confront a monster was not just to face a beast of flesh and bone. It was to confront something far more primal, a force that could consume your very soul. Ceremonies were the battlegrounds where humanity fought these invisible forces. It was said that with the right invocation, the gods could be summoned to control monsters, or the very monsters themselves could be called forth to protect or punish. But it was a dangerous game. One slip, one mistake, and the monster would not leave. Instead, it would claim its place, dragging its horrific presence deeper into the world, feeding on fear and chaos. There were rituals designed to call upon monsters, to manipulate them into becoming servants. The flames would burn brighter, the chants would grow louder, and the monster, sometimes a creature of shadow, sometimes a beast of unimaginable size, would rise from the depths of the ritual space. The air would crackle with an energy that left the hairs on the back of the neck standing straight. The priests and shamans, their eyes wild with purpose, would stand firm, guiding the monster with words, gestures, and offerings. The creature, bound by the ancient laws of magic, would obey, for a time. But those who used such power were never the same afterward. The connection to a monster left scars, invisible yet deep. The ritual, while bringing power and strength, would always demand a price, something that could never be repaid. The monster, having been called, would often grow restless, demanding more than had been promised. And the one who had invoked it would find themselves marked, haunted by the creature's memory, by the dark presence that lingered long after the fire had died. On the other side of the coin, there were rituals of protection, ceremonies designed to ward off monsters that would not be tamed. With every chant, the earth would rumble in response, the elements themselves bending to the will of those who knew the sacred words. Sacred symbols, drawn in the sand or carved into the walls of temples, would glow with a divine light, sealing the monsters out from the world of men. Yet, even as the monsters were kept at bay, a heavy unease always lingered. The ceremony might end, the incense might burn out, and the walls of the temple might grow quiet once more, but the knowledge that the monsters still existed, out there in the world, could never be fully erased. The protection granted by the rituals was a temporary shield, fragile as the thin air of the mountains. One misstep, one mistake in the sacred words, and the monsters would breach the barriers once more. These rituals were not just performed for the living, but for the dead as well. When a soul passed into the afterlife, it was believed that the monsters of the underworld might try to claim it. In some cultures, the dead were given offerings, food, drink, or symbols of protection, to ensure that their journey to the afterlife was unimpeded by monsters. Some would even bury objects with the dead, items meant to ward off creatures that could drag the spirit back into the darkness. But the monsters did not only live in the shadows or in distant lands. They were with us always. They were the fear we couldn't shake, the nightmares we couldn't escape. The rituals, the sacred ceremonies, were as much for the mind as for the body. For in those moments of intense prayer, of chanting, of communion with the divine, the people believed that they could confront their deepest fears. They believed that by controlling the monsters in these rituals, they could somehow control the monsters within themselves. And as the fire burned low, and the smoke swirled up to the heavens, they could feel a sense of power, a fleeting moment of triumph over the things that haunted them. But then there were the darker rites, the ones performed under the cover of night, far from prying eyes. These rituals were whispered about, spoken of only in hushed tones, because they were said to summon not only the monsters, but something far worse, chaos itself. In these ceremonies, the lines between good and evil, life and death, became blurred. The monster that was called forth was not one of the gods or the benevolent forces that protected humanity. It was something raw, something ancient. The air would grow thick, the earth would tremble, and the people would hold their breath, waiting for what would come. And sometimes, what emerged from the dark was not what they had expected. Monsters, it seemed, had their own will. No amount of ritual or ceremony could ever fully tame them. Even in the light of the most powerful prayers, and the shelter of the most intricate symbols, the monsters would occasionally break free. The world would be left in chaos, the ancient gods powerless to stop it. In those moments, the people would turn to their last, most desperate hope. The very rituals that had once called forth the monsters could now be used to banish them. It was a never-ending cycle, one that has echoed throughout history. For every invocation, there was a counter-curse. For every monster summoned, there was another waiting to be bound. The people of the ancient world understood, perhaps better than anyone, the fine line between controlling the monsters and being consumed by them. They knew that each ceremony, each ritual, was a gamble, not just with their lives, but with their souls. The monsters, once called, could never truly be forgotten. They lived on in the hearts of those who dared to invoke them, in the whispers of the elders who had seen too much, and the nightmares that came when the night was darkest. The rituals were a fragile shield, and the monsters, lurking in the shadows, were always just a breath away. There was a time when the world trembled under the weight of an ancient fear, a fear so primal it seeped into every corner of existence. It was the fear of chaos, the unrelenting force that threatened to tear apart the fabric of everything. But in that same fear, there was also a strange comfort. For in the battle against chaos, and the confrontation with the monstrous forces that embodied it, something greater was forged. Something that could withstand time, death, and destruction. It wasn't that the monsters themselves were feared. It was what they represented. They were not just beasts with claws and fangs, creatures of the shadows or the dark depths of the oceans. No, they were symbols. They were the raw, untamed force of chaos, primordial and destructive. But in their very existence, they held the power to shape the world. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the world is still and the winds whisper ancient secrets, the people of old would stand at the edge of their villages, watching the first light of day touch the earth. It was a time when the very ground beneath their feet felt fragile, as if the universe itself could crumble. But it was also a time when they could feel something stirring, something ancient and powerful, something they knew they had to face. It was the monsters. They could not avoid them. They could not escape them. They were part of the cycle, part of the grand dance of creation and destruction. The monsters came in many forms, serpents that coiled around the earth, dragons that spread fire across the skies, beasts with many heads and many claws, each one more terrifying than the last. But for all their terror, they were not simply there to destroy. They had a purpose, one that went beyond the terror they caused. For every time they appeared, it was a sign. A sign that the old order was being tested, that the world itself was about to change. In the eyes of the ancient people, the monsters were not just agents of destruction. They were the very things that cleared the path for creation. In the destruction they brought, new worlds could be born. Without the chaos, there could be no order. The very cosmos itself depended on this delicate balance. A balance between life and death, light and dark, order and chaos. The stories passed down from generation to generation spoke of heroes who faced the monstrous forces, who battled them with strength, with courage, and with wisdom. But these heroes weren't simply fighting for survival. They were fighting to restore the balance. When the monsters rose, it was a call to arms, not just to fight, but to understand, to bring about the necessary upheaval that would allow the world to be reborn. It was said that after every battle, after every victory over chaos, the hero would not simply return to their village as a conqueror. No, they would return as a guide, a keeper of balance. Their victory over the monster was not just for themselves, it was for all of creation. They had faced the chaos and lived to tell the tale, and in doing so, they had forged the way for the cosmos to continue its eternal cycle. But the battle was not without cost. For in each victory, there was always a sacrifice. The monster, though defeated, left its mark. The chaos it brought would never fully disappear. Even in the aftermath, the memory of the monster's terror would linger in the hearts of the people, reminding them that the balance between order and chaos was fragile. Every generation would have to face it again. But it was that very struggle, that very tension between the two forces, that made the world turn, that made life possible. The monsters themselves were not evil, nor were they inherently good. They were simply forces of nature, reflections of the chaos that lived within the universe. They were the winds before a storm, the floodwaters that carried away everything in their path, the fire that consumed everything it touched. They had no malice. They simply existed, as much a part of the world as the sun that rose every day or the moon that watched over the night. In the darkness, where the monsters thrived, there was also a strange kind of order. The people knew this. They understood that, in facing the beasts, they were not only confronting the monsters themselves, they were confronting their own fears. The monsters were mirrors, reflecting the darkness within the hearts of those who fought them. And in this reflection, there was a chance to understand, to learn, and to grow. Each time the monsters came, there was a chance to renew the world, to test the strength of those who lived in it. The chaos they brought was a challenge to see if humanity could rise above it, could stand firm against the storm and rebuild. And in the rebuilding, the world grew stronger, more resilient, more prepared for the next challenge. But it wasn't just the heroes who understood this. The people knew that they, too, had a part to play. They were the ones who tended the fires, who offered prayers and sacrifices, who kept the memory of the monsters alive so that the lessons of the past would not be forgotten. They, too, faced the monsters, not with swords and shields, but with hearts full of hope and courage. They knew that as long as they held onto the knowledge that chaos could be overcome, the world would continue. It was in this cycle, this endless dance between chaos and order, that the true beauty of existence lay. The monsters were not just the forces that threatened to destroy. They were the very things that made creation possible. And in the darkest hours, when the monsters seemed too great to overcome, it was the faith in the balance, the belief that the world could be remade, that kept the people moving forward. They knew that without the monsters, there could be no peace. Without chaos, there could be no order. And in the battle between the two, the world was shaped, again and again, in the image of those who fought to protect it. There's a strange, unsettling feeling that washes over you when you look into the eyes of a creature that isn't quite human, but isn't quite animal either. It's something in the way they gaze back at you, something that feels ancient, familiar, and yet foreign all at once. These beings, half human, half animal, seem to exist in the space between the known and the unknown. They stir a sense of awe, a sense of fear, and a quiet curiosity that has lingered in human hearts for centuries. The first time you see one, it's as though you've stepped into a world that blurs the lines of reality itself. The gods, the guardians, the monsters, they were not just stories told by firelight. They were real, living creatures, brought to life in the imaginations of those who tried to make sense of the world around them. These hybrids were not just born from the need for myth, they were born from the need to understand the world's mysteries, to represent the forces of nature, of chaos, and of order. The creatures you see in the carvings, in the stories, have the body of a lion but the head of a man, or the body of a serpent but the wings of an eagle. These creatures were not just imagined, they were symbols, each part of them a piece of a greater puzzle, a key to unlocking the deeper truths of the world. A lion's strength and courage. A serpent's wisdom and danger. An eagle's freedom and vision. These hybrids were more than beasts, they were the embodiment of the traits that defined both humans and nature. And in that fusion, they held the power to reveal what could not be put into words. The ancient peoples didn't simply create these beings for decoration. They were meant to represent something larger, something powerful. A man with the head of a bird, for example, wasn't just a man with wings, he was someone who could soar above the chaos, who could see things from a higher perspective. A lion-headed god wasn't just fearsome, he embodied the strength that lay in leadership, the courage needed to protect, to fight, and to endure. These hybrids showed the blending of worlds, human and animal, mortal and divine. They captured something in their forms that the human mind could not fully understand, but nonetheless, they were drawn to it, captivated by it. In every culture that painted these creatures into their myths, there was a belief that the human spirit was linked to the forces of nature. People weren't separate from the world around them. They were part of it. And these hybrids were the perfect expression of that connection. A human with the wings of an eagle wasn't just a creature of fantasy, they were a symbol of the soul's potential to rise above earthly constraints. The beasts that walked the earth, the creatures that ruled the skies, they weren't separate from the human heart. They were part of the same cosmic dance, creatures that humans could learn from, emulate, and aspire to. But the more you look, the more you realize that these creatures weren't just heroes or gods. They were also the monsters that came from the shadows, the fears that lurked at the edges of human understanding. The monster with the face of a man but the body of a beast. The terror of what it meant to cross that boundary, to fuse two worlds into one. For in every hybrid being, there was the fear of what could happen when boundaries were crossed, when the laws of nature were twisted and bent. These creatures were not just part of nature, they were also the consequence of nature gone wrong, of forces that existed beyond human control. To look at one of these beings is to see the fine line between creation and destruction, between the divine and the monstrous. What happens when the line between man and animal blurs? When gods and beasts are combined into one form? It's a question that echoes through the ages, as people wondered how much of themselves they saw in these hybrids. Could they be more than what they were? Could they transcend their earthly forms and become something greater? Or were they doomed to be trapped in the space between, never fully belonging to either world? The ancient myths that surrounded these beings weren't just about the monsters they represented. They were about the choices people had to make when they faced chaos. When the animal side of us took over, when instinct and survival ruled, could we retain our humanity? Could we be both beast and man, and still hold on to the essence of what it meant to be human? But as much as these creatures were warnings, they were also invitations. They called to something deep within the human heart, something primal and ancient. They called to the parts of us that wanted to transcend, to rise above the ordinary, to embrace both the light and the dark. They reminded us that there was no true separation between man and nature, between divinity and mortality. All of these things existed together, in a delicate balance. And these hybrids were the proof of that balance. Look closely at the eyes of these creatures, the eyes that have witnessed centuries of change, of conflict, of growth. They are not just eyes of beasts, but of gods, of humans, and of the earth itself. They hold the wisdom of those who have walked the earth before us, the wisdom of those who have seen the world from heights we can only dream of. In their gaze, there is a connection to the very soul of existence, a reminder that, though we may walk the earth as humans, we are never truly separate from the creatures that roam it with us. We are all part of the same wild, untamed beauty, caught in the mystery of life's endless cycle. And perhaps, just perhaps, the hybrids aren't simply a glimpse into the world of the gods or the monsters. Perhaps, they are a reflection of who we truly are, caught between the divine and the earthly, the human and the animal, struggling to understand our place in the grand, chaotic dance of life. There's a certain chill that runs down your spine when you hear the word monster. Not just the hideous, clawed creatures from childhood nightmares, but the kind that's far more dangerous because it wears the face of something you already know. The kind that creeps into your consciousness disguised as something simple, yet it is anything but. It is a thing that calls to something primal in us, something that makes us see what we fear, what we despise, in the twisted shape of a beast. In the halls of power, where the air is thick with tension, where threats are whispered and enemies are drawn in secret, the monsters don't just exist in tales and dark corners. They are alive, pulsing in the shadows, always there, waiting to be named. These aren't creatures of myth or legend. They are the foreign invaders, the unseen forces that lurk beyond borders, threatening to breach the walls of a kingdom. The monster is the embodiment of the enemy, a force of chaos and destruction made tangible, a symbol of everything that can tear apart the delicate fabric of power. When a nation faces its enemies, the fear they stir in the hearts of its people is not just fear of physical harm. It's fear of everything being undone, everything falling apart. It's the fear of being swallowed whole by something bigger, something more powerful. This fear doesn't just manifest as worry or concern, it grows into something darker. It takes shape. It becomes the monster. It is a monster with eyes that gleam with the hunger for conquest, with claws that can shred empires. It is the beast that roams the land with the sole purpose of destruction, an unstoppable force driven by a need to take, to dominate, to erase everything that stands in its way. The people hear its roar in the distant winds and feel its breath hot on their necks as it comes closer, one step at a time. These beasts are not made from the nightmares of the human mind. They are made from the fear of invasion, of oppression, of being swallowed up by an enemy that threatens to erase everything you know. These monsters are the physical embodiment of a kingdom's deepest, darkest fears. They are not just born from the imagination, they are shaped by the very real, very urgent threats that a nation faces in its darkest hours. They are made to represent the crushing weight of foreign powers, the impending doom of being overrun, consumed, lost. And as the enemy grows closer, the monster becomes larger. It's no longer just a shadow lurking on the horizon. It is a vast, terrifying force, a creature with the power to consume entire civilizations in a single, crushing bite. Its roar echoes through the mountains, and its eyes blaze with the fury of an unstoppable army. The people see this monster not as a mere story, they see it as their enemy, the one that threatens to destroy everything they hold dear. But monsters don't just tear down the walls of the city. They destroy the very idea of peace. The idea that everything can remain stable, unshaken. When a nation faces its monster, it faces more than just a physical threat, it faces the destruction of its very identity. The monster is not just a conqueror. It is a reminder that the world is not as safe as it seems. It is a warning that anything can fall, that nothing is secure, and that any moment, a beast could rise up and take everything. In those moments, the fear of the monster becomes something more. It becomes the rallying cry for those who will fight to protect their lands, their families, their way of life. The monster is not just the enemy, it is the very symbol of the fight for survival, the fight for everything that makes a people who they are. To face the monster is to face the world's harshest truths, the knowledge that, in the end, all that stands between peace and chaos is the strength of those who refuse to fall. But the monster also reveals the fragility of civilization itself. It shows how easily everything can be undone. A single shift, a single crack in the wall, and everything can crumble. The monster is not just a creature, it is a lesson, a constant reminder of how close the edge really is. The more powerful the enemy, the more monstrous it becomes. It grows larger, more terrifying, until it seems like nothing in the world can stand against it. And yet, in the face of this terrible force, there are those who will rise, armed with nothing but the knowledge that they must defend their world. The monsters that are born from these fears are never simple. They are not just beasts to be vanquished. They are symbols of what is at stake. They carry the weight of everything that must be protected. They remind the people of what can be lost. And as they loom ever closer, as the enemy grows in power, the question becomes, will the walls hold? Or will the monsters, real or imagined, finally break through, consuming everything in their path? These creatures stand as constant threats, reminders that what we hold most dear is always at risk. But in the face of such terror, the human spirit responds. The heroes rise. They fight, not just to save their homes, but to preserve the very idea of what it means to be free, to be safe, to live without fear of being consumed by the chaos that threatens from every side. And so the monster becomes a symbol of the enemy that exists not just in the form of another nation, but in the dark corners of our own hearts, the parts of us that fear what we don't understand. It's a symbol of the constant battle between order and chaos, the never-ending fight for survival that lies at the heart of every civilization. The monster is the enemy, but it is also the test. It is the challenge. And it is through facing this creature, this embodiment of our deepest fears, that we find the strength to rise, to protect, and to fight for all that we hold sacred. There's a chill that lingers when the monster you fear isn't just a creature, but a woman. The air thickens, and the hair on the back of your neck stands up as you realize that some monsters have the shape of a woman, her face twisted with fury, her eyes cold with hunger, her body a deadly weapon. It's in the way her beauty is a mask, hiding something dark and terrible. In the ancient world, these women weren't just women. They were monsters, embodiments of chaos, destruction, and terror. Her form is both alluring and terrifying. The seduction of a smile that promises both pleasure and pain. The grace of a dancer that transforms into the strike of a serpent's bite. These are monsters of the feminine, monstrous figures whose very existence challenges the line between beauty and fear, between nurturing and destruction. These creatures are shaped by more than just their physical form. They are made from the stories of the past, from the fears that plague societies about power, sexuality, and the uncontrollable forces of the feminine. The stories are as old as time itself. Lilith, with her wild hair and dark eyes, lures men into a nightmarish world where they are consumed by desire and despair. Medusa, once a woman cursed and transformed into a monster, whose gaze turns men into stone. The Sirens, whose song promises death with the softest of melodies, drawing sailors to their doom. These creatures, born of myth and legend, reveal a fear that has haunted societies for millennia, the fear of women who cannot be controlled, women who wield power beyond their means. They are not the sweet, passive figures often depicted in folklore. These monsters are fierce, untamed, dangerous. They reject the traditional roles of women, those roles that confine them to silence, obedience, and meekness. Instead, these women rule in their own right, and it is this power, this uncontrollable, raw, wild power, that makes them monstrous. They embody the darker aspects of femininity, those that cannot be tamed, those that refuse to fit neatly into any box. And yet, as terrifying as they are, these figures are also tragic. There is a deep sadness woven into their stories, a sense of loss, a sense of punishment. These women, in many ways, are victims of their own power. Their monstrosity is often a punishment, a consequence of something they have done, something they have become. Medusa, once beautiful and revered, is punished by the gods, transformed into something grotesque after a violent violation. Lilith is cast out for daring to stand up for herself, for not submitting to Adam. These women are cast aside, turned into monsters not because they were born evil, but because they dared to show their strength, their independence. What makes these stories even more haunting is the way they reflect the fear of the feminine, of a power that cannot be controlled, that cannot be contained. These monsters are born from the minds of those who feared the destruction that could come if women wielded power unchecked. It's a reflection of the darkest fears, the idea that a woman, in her full force, could tear down the world as we know it. She could unmake everything that men have built. But there's something else in these stories. Something deeper, something more heart-wrenching. These monsters are, in a sense, warnings. Warnings about what happens when the feminine is ignored, suppressed, or destroyed. These creatures, in their monstrous forms, are a cry for attention, a desperate plea to be seen. They are women who have been rejected, forgotten, or violated by the world around them. They are not born from evil, but from pain, from the fear of being silenced, from the terror of losing oneself in a world that demands submission. And yet, in their monstrosity, there is also a deep, undeniable power. They do not go quietly into the night. They roar, they fight, they destroy. Their anger, their grief, their pain, it all becomes their weapon. It's a weapon that, ironically, comes from their rejection. Their monstrous nature is the only way they can be heard, the only way they can regain control. These feminine monsters are complex, their stories tangled with layers of power, submission, and rebellion. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about gender, about the way we view women and power. They challenge us to rethink what it means to be strong, to be powerful, to be a woman. They force us to face our own fears, our own insecurities, about power that lies outside of our control. When we look at these monsters, we are not just looking at women who have been turned into beasts. We are looking at the embodiment of chaos itself, a chaos that exists within all of us. The desire to break free, to rebel, to take back what was lost. We are looking at the raw, untamed energy of a woman who refuses to conform, who refuses to be what society expects her to be. She may be monstrous, but in her monstrosity, there is an undeniable truth: she is real, and she cannot be ignored. The fear of the feminine, of women who are not controlled, has always been present in these monstrous stories. But there is also something else in them, a reminder that this power, while terrifying, is also beautiful. It is a power that, when harnessed, can create as much as it can destroy. These monsters are not just terrifying, they are tragic, they are human, they are powerful. They are a reflection of the very real battles women face when they fight for their right to be seen, to be heard, to be understood. And in the end, the most haunting part of these stories is the realization that the monsters are not just external forces. They are within us all. The fear of the feminine, the fear of chaos, the fear of destruction, all of it is bound together, twisted into a shape that makes us tremble. The monsters are not always easy to see, but they are always there, waiting in the dark corners of our minds. The ancient world, with all its mysteries, these ancient creatures were not just figments of imagination, they were deeply rooted in the struggles of life, in the need for control, and in the understanding of what happens when that control slips away. They were the personification of chaos, and their legacy is woven into every tale of heroism, fear, and survival that we tell today. As you read the epic stories of the ancient Near East, you begin to see patterns emerge. Monsters weren't just evil creatures, they were guardians of thresholds, protectors of boundaries. They were there to stop the unwary traveler from crossing into a realm they couldn't understand, a world they weren't ready for. They were the ever-present reminder that the world beyond the known was wild, untamed, and dangerous. And even as time marched forward, these monsters didn't simply fade into obscurity. They morphed and adapted, taking on new forms and new meanings. But the essence of what they represented remained unchanged. The ancient gods, like those of Mesopotamia and Persia, were complex beings, some kind and others terrifying, yet all carrying a bit of the monstrous within them. In the shifting sands of myth, these gods would sometimes take on monstrous forms, reflecting their fierce, unpredictable power. Think of the mighty storm gods, whose tempers could devastate entire cities. Or the wrath of Enlil, who could bring both creation and destruction with a single command. These gods were never just distant figures, they were forces of nature, as untamable and destructive as any monster lurking in the dark. And it's no wonder that they would evolve, morphing over centuries into the villains and creatures of more modern mythologies. As the centuries rolled on, these ancient Near Eastern monsters would be remembered in the legends of Greece, Rome, and beyond. The Babylonians' fearsome serpentine deities, like Tiamat, evolved into creatures like the Medusa, whose gaze could turn men to stone. The great winged lions of Assyria became the griffins of Greek myth, symbols of protection and power. Even the idea of creatures with the bodies of animals and the faces of men would echo through time, inspiring the hybrid monsters that would appear in the stories of Europe and Asia. The legacy of these monsters didn't just vanish into the past, it carved out a permanent place in the stories that followed. But their influence isn't confined to mythology. The echoes of these ancient monsters still rise in our culture, seen in the modern films, books, and stories that continue to reflect the fears and desires that first birthed them. The monsters of the ancient world didn't just inspire stories, they became metaphors for our deepest fears. We still fear chaos, the uncontrollable forces that could tear our lives apart. We fear that our attempts to impose order on the world might be futile in the face of something much larger and more powerful. In this way, the ancient monsters serve as a mirror to our own struggles with control and chaos. Their terrifying faces remind us of the fragile boundaries that separate the known from the unknown, the safe from the dangerous. Even today, the images of monstrous beings from the ancient world appear in the dark corners of our imaginations. The fearsome, multi-headed hydras, the hideous half-man, half-beast creatures, they still haunt us. The gods and monsters of the Near East, in their many forms, have become templates for the evil beings we create in our stories. In films and television shows, we see the monstrous archetypes take shape again. The creatures that lurk in the shadows, the beasts who roam freely, are born of the same ancient fears. The idea of a monster guarding a threshold, standing between the world of the living and the unknown, still stirs something deep within us. But there's something more to these ancient monsters than just their terrifying nature. They represent a desire to understand the forces beyond our control, to come to terms with the world's most profound mysteries. These monsters, though frightening, are not just evil, they are also part of the natural order, forces that must be reckoned with if we are to navigate life. Their presence in ancient myths and their continued influence in modern storytelling show us that even as our world has changed, our basic fears remain the same. And so, these ancient monsters live on, not as mere remnants of the past, but as living, breathing symbols that still speak to us. They show us the darkness in the world, the chaos that threatens to overwhelm us all, and the strength required to face it. They teach us that monsters are not simply to be feared, they must be understood, for they are part of us. Every monster that has ever haunted the human imagination carries within it a story, a warning, and a truth. The monsters of the ancient Near East were the first to show us this truth, and their legacy endures, haunting us still. These ancient monsters are far from forgotten. Their stories continue to shape our understanding of fear, of strength, and of the very nature of the unknown. They remind us that we have always faced the same forces, and in some ways, we always will. They are the legacy of a world that knew the terrifying power of the chaotic, the monstrous, and the unknown, and that legacy will echo through our stories, forever. The sound of a distant growl echoes through the mind, a low, rumbling tremor that shakes the soul to its very core. It's the call of the ancient monsters, creatures that have been feared and revered for millennia. But why do these beasts persist in the deepest recesses of our thoughts? Why do we still return to their stories, again and again, even as centuries slip into the past? The monsters that once roamed the world of the ancient Near East didn't just haunt the imagination, they were, and still are, reflections of the struggles that every human faces. Their stories are more than simple tales of fear and danger. They represent something universal, something so ingrained in the human experience that it transcends time and space. These creatures, with their fangs, claws, and terrifying forms, are not merely products of ancient myth, they are part of the very fabric of our understanding of life itself. Think about the monsters of the ancient world, those beings that could tear down cities, that could shift the earth beneath your feet, that could swallow the sun itself. These creatures didn't just walk the earth, they represented forces that were beyond human comprehension. The fear they inspired wasn't just fear of the beast in front of you, but of the unknown that lay behind the beast. It was a fear of chaos, of the unpredictable nature of the universe, of the world that could easily slip from order into destruction. But there is a certain power in the monster. There's something magnetic about these creatures, something that draws us in. We're afraid of them, yes, but we are also fascinated by them. There's something about standing at the edge of that abyss, looking into the darkness, that makes us feel alive. Monsters teach us about the limits of our strength, the depths of our courage, and the importance of facing the unknown. It's not just that we are fascinated by their terrifying forms, it's that we are captivated by what they represent, the struggle for survival, the desire to impose order on chaos, and the recognition that, sometimes, we must become monsters ourselves to defeat them. In every myth, these monsters played a crucial role. They were more than just villains. They were thresholds. They were the walls between the known and the unknown, between the safe and the dangerous. The heroes of the ancient world, be they gods, kings, or mere mortals, could not cross into new realms or claim new powers without first confronting these terrifying forces. The monsters were necessary. They weren't just obstacles to be overcome, they were gatekeepers to greater understanding, to deeper truths. To defeat the monster was to prove one's worthiness to face the challenges that lay ahead. They stood at the edges of the world, daring you to approach, daring you to reach beyond your comfort zone, to test your own strength. There's a strange beauty in the way these creatures reflect our own inner battles. The monsters were often forces of chaos, but so too are our fears. The uncertainty of life, the unpredictability of the world, the terror of facing the unknown, these are the real monsters we face each day. And just as ancient heroes had to confront the beasts lurking in the shadows, so too must we face the monsters within ourselves. They are the fears that prevent us from moving forward, the doubts that hold us back, the challenges that threaten to swallow us whole. But in facing them, in defeating them, we find our own power. We gain the courage to push forward, to conquer what once seemed impossible. These monsters, in their many forms, are not just ancient stories, they are mirrors. They reflect the fears and desires of the people who first created them, and in turn, they reflect our own. The demons of the ancient world were the personifications of the unknown, but they were also the personifications of transformation. The hero's journey is, at its core, a journey of self-discovery. To confront a monster is to confront oneself, to face the deepest parts of our psyche. And in that confrontation, there is an opportunity for change, for growth, for evolution. The monster represents both the obstacle and the lesson. The fear it inspires is not just a fear of the unknown, but a fear of change, a fear of losing control, a fear of letting go. And yet, in the face of these monsters, we also find hope. For the hero who confronts the monster is never the same person who first faced it. The challenge of battling the beast is not just about survival, it's about transformation. It's about becoming something more than what we were. The monsters serve as catalysts for change, forcing the hero to confront their own weaknesses, to find strength in places they never knew existed. They force the hero to face the abyss and then walk away from it, stronger and wiser than before. In the quiet moments of reflection, it's clear that these ancient creatures weren't just figments of imagination, they were lessons, gifts wrapped in terrifying forms. They taught us about the delicate balance between chaos and order, about the need to confront our deepest fears, and about the strength that comes from overcoming the things that seem insurmountable. They taught us that there is no transformation without struggle, no growth without pain. They reminded us that sometimes, the only way to move forward is to face the very thing we fear most. So, as the myths and legends of ancient monsters echo through the ages, we find that their lessons are as relevant now as they were thousands of years ago. The creatures of the ancient Near East were not just the stuff of nightmares, they were the architects of the human experience, guiding us through the darkness, showing us the way forward. And in their terrifying forms, they left us with a gift, the courage to confront the monsters of our own making, the strength to face the chaos, and the wisdom to understand that the only way to overcome fear is to look it in the eye and move forward, no matter what. The screen flickers to life, and a towering figure emerges from the shadows. The monster is no longer just a creature of nightmares, but something that feels all too real. Its eyes gleam with an unnatural hunger, its movements slow and deliberate as if it knows it is being watched. The sound of its footsteps is heavy, each one echoing in the chest of anyone who dares to face it. The fear is palpable, and yet, there is something magnetic about it. We can't look away. The beast on screen, despite its terrifying nature, has a pull, a deep, primal draw that connects with something deep inside us. Monsters in modern media are not just creatures that haunt our dreams, they are mirrors of the darkest corners of our own souls. They are reflections of our deepest fears, our unspoken desires, and the chaos that lingers just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. They walk the line between reality and fantasy, always pushing us to confront what we would rather leave hidden. Whether it's the slithering tentacles of a creature from the deep, the monstrous humanoid stalking through a deserted town, or the strange and unsettling hybrid forms that crawl from ancient myths into contemporary stories, these monsters carry a message that continues to resonate with audiences today. Every horror film, every science fiction novel, every piece of art that features a monster carries within it a thread from the past. These creatures are not just born of modern minds, they are descendants of the ancient myths and legends, creatures that have evolved with us over centuries. They speak to us on a level that is primal, tapping into the same fears that ancient civilizations once felt. The monster was born of chaos, of the unknown, of the wild forces that threatened to unravel the world. And though our worlds have changed, that primal fear remains. Monsters are more than just figures on a screen, they are the embodiment of the struggle between order and chaos, between the known and the unknown. But what is it about these creatures that keeps us coming back for more? Why do we keep writing stories about them, creating films that feature them, and drawing pictures of them, even as we live in a world of technology and progress? Perhaps it's because the monster, in all its grotesque and terrifying forms, reminds us of the fragility of our own existence. It forces us to confront our deepest vulnerabilities, the places where we are weakest, where we are most afraid. There is something deeply cathartic about facing the monster. It allows us to stare into the darkness and say, "I am not afraid. I will fight. The power of these creatures lies in their symbolism. They represent the forces that we cannot control, the things that we cannot predict or understand. Monsters in modern media have taken on new forms, but their essence remains unchanged. Whether it's the alien invader, the undead rising from the grave, or the ancient god awakened after centuries of slumber, the monster represents the fear of the unknown. It is the fear of what we cannot see, cannot understand, and cannot contain. It is the fear of losing control. In every monster story, there is a moment of confrontation. The hero, be they human or otherwise, must face the beast head-on, often risking their life to do so. And in that moment, there is a transformation. The hero changes. They learn something about themselves, something they could never have known if they had not faced the monster. And just like the ancient myths, these modern stories echo the same themes: growth, self-discovery, and the triumph of courage over fear. The monster may be defeated, but the hero is forever changed. Yet, it's not always about defeating the monster. Sometimes, the beast in the story is more than just a physical threat. It represents something much deeper, something more personal. It could be the trauma that haunts a character's past, or the fear of being alone, or the overwhelming pressure of societal expectations. In these stories, the monster is a metaphor, a physical manifestation of the struggles that we all face. The monster in these tales may not be defeated in the traditional sense, but by confronting it, the characters, and by extension, the audience, are able to find a way to live with it. The monster, in all its terrifying glory, becomes a part of the story's resolution. There is something beautifully tragic about the monsters in modern media. They are often the products of human error, of scientific experiments gone wrong, or of ancient wrongs that are awakened after centuries of slumber. These monsters are not born evil, they are twisted by the world around them, shaped by the choices of the people who created them, or by forces beyond their control. In this way, the monster becomes a symbol of the fragility of humanity itself. It reminds us that we, too, are vulnerable to the chaos of the world, and that even our best intentions can give birth to something monstrous. And as much as we are terrified by these creatures, we are also drawn to them. There is something deeply fascinating about the unknown, about the things we can't quite grasp. Monsters allow us to confront these things in a way that feels safe. We can face the darkness on the screen, in a book, or in a painting, and experience the thrill of fear without ever having to leave the comfort of our own world. We can look at the creature and know that it is not real, that it is just a story, a creation of human imagination. But even so, it doesn't feel that way. The monster feels real. It feels alive, and in that moment, it reminds us that our world is not as controlled as we like to think. There is chaos out there, and the monster is its face. In the end, it's clear that monsters in modern media will never fade away. They are part of us, embedded deep within our collective psyche. They are the dark mirrors reflecting the fears, desires, and struggles that shape our lives. We will continue to create them, to tell their stories, and to marvel at their terrifying beauty, because in facing them, we are able to face the darkest parts of ourselves. The monster may be a creature of nightmares, but it is also a teacher, a guide, and in many ways, a hero in its own right. There it is. A small, ancient artifact, no bigger than the palm of your hand. A carved stone, faded with age, yet the image etched on it still sends chills down your spine. At first glance, it might seem like a simple piece of art, a small trinket to adorn a forgotten king's chamber or a temple's altar. But as you look closer, your eyes begin to trace the shapes, twisted and jagged. You begin to recognize the figure that has been frozen in time, staring back at you with a mixture of awe and terror. The monster. But not just any monster. This one is ancient, its gaze and form a direct connection to a world long lost. The monster etched on this stone doesn't just stand as decoration, it carries with it a message. It's a symbol, a warning, a relic of a culture whose people believe deeply in the power of creatures that walk the edge of reality. In archaeology, every artifact holds a story, and often, those stories involve the creatures that once haunted the imagination of ancient cultures. These monsters, etched in stone, painted on pottery, sculpted in clay, are more than just drawings or figures. They are clues. They are windows into the fears, beliefs, and worldviews of people who lived thousands of years ago, people who were just as fascinated, terrified, and inspired by monsters as we are today. Take the image of a creature from an ancient civilization, half man, half animal, standing proudly at the entrance of a temple. To the untrained eye, it might simply appear to be an abstract or decorative figure. But in the context of the civilization that created it, it's a powerful, living presence. Its hybrid form speaks to a worldview in which boundaries between human and animal, the real and the imagined, were not so firmly drawn. This figure, perhaps a demon, perhaps a god, was there to guard, to protect, or to destroy. It was a guardian of thresholds, a sentinel between the known world and the unknown. As we trace our fingers over these artifacts in a museum, it's as though we can feel the weight of the centuries that separate us from the people who crafted them. Their hands, so different from ours, yet somehow so similar. These ancient artists didn't just carve, they imbued their creations with meaning. Every twist of the chisel, every line etched into the surface of a vase, every figure on a piece of pottery, was a reflection of the world they lived in. These monsters weren't just creatures of fantasy. They were metaphors, lessons in the form of beasts that helped the people of that time understand their place in the cosmos. They were representations of forces that could not be tamed, forces that were beyond human comprehension. Chaos, danger, death. But also, protection, strength, and the promise of rebirth. One image that stands out, found in a forgotten tomb, is of a serpent coiled around a human figure, its eyes gleaming with a sense of triumph. To modern eyes, it might seem like a simple depiction of a predator and its prey. But to those who saw it in the distant past, it was far more than that. The serpent was a symbol of death, but also of wisdom. Its image on a tombstone might not just represent the death of an individual, but also the idea of transformation, of passing from one world to the next, of shedding the old skin to emerge anew. The monster here wasn't just a threat, it was a necessary force, an agent of change. The people who created these depictions believed that to face the monster was to face your deepest fears, and perhaps, even conquer them. On the other side of the world, in ancient Mesopotamia, the monsters were often guardians. The Lamassu, a creature with the body of a lion, wings of an eagle, and the head of a man, stood tall at the gates of temples and palaces. These creatures weren't born out of fear, they were born out of reverence and protection. The hybrid nature of the Lamassu was not just a physical fusion of creatures, but a fusion of ideas, the blending of the divine and the earthly, the human and the beast, the known and the unknown. This monstrous figure was not a creature to be feared, but to be respected. It was a figure that embodied the balance of the universe. Its presence at the threshold was a reminder that we stand at the crossroads of life and death, light and darkness, human and divine. Every time the ancient people walked past these monstrous beings, they were reminded of the power they held over the world around them. These ancient creatures weren't confined to the pages of myth or the carvings on walls. They were present in every aspect of daily life. They were invoked in rituals, in prayers, and in ceremonies meant to protect, to heal, or to curse. And these depictions, frozen in time on artifacts, are more than just remnants of the past. They are the living testament to the ways in which ancient cultures engaged with their world. The monsters were not just in stories, they were part of the fabric of life. They were real, and they demanded attention. In many cases, the monsters we see in ancient art are meant to be warnings. They stand as reminders of the chaos that lurks just beyond the veil of civilization, of the primal forces that civilization seeks to keep at bay. And yet, these monsters are also the embodiment of human resilience. For within their monstrous forms, there is strength to confront the unknown, to stare down fear, and to assert control over forces that are inherently uncontrollable. They were symbols of the courage to face what lies beneath the surface, what lies in the darkness. As archaeologists sift through the ruins of ancient civilizations, they uncover these monsters like long-forgotten dreams. Each artifact, whether it be a statue of a demon or a small figurine of a winged beast, reveals a little more of the world these people inhabited. These creatures were more than just art, they were part of a larger conversation, a conversation about life, death, the divine, and the unknown. And as we look at these creatures today, through the lens of modernity, we realize that they still speak to us, just as they spoke to those who first carved them. Their presence transcends time. The monsters of the past are not simply relics of a bygone era, they are mirrors, reflecting the timeless struggle of humankind to understand its place in the vast, mysterious world. There's a moment, right before sleep, when the shadows in your room seem to grow larger, and every creak of the house feels louder. You lie in bed, frozen, heart racing, your mind trying to separate reality from something darker, something ancient. The monsters don't just live in the pages of stories or in ancient myths. They live in the corners of your mind, lurking in the depths where your greatest fears lie. They are not just creatures with claws and fangs, they are symbols of something much deeper, something that shakes you to your core. What is it that makes us afraid? Why do we feel that primal dread when we hear a rustle in the dark or catch a glimpse of something moving just out of sight? The monsters of our childhood stories are not so different from the ones that haunted ancient civilizations. They come from the same place, the same source of human anxiety. But these monsters are not mere fantasy. They are reflections of our deepest, most universal fears, fears that transcend time and culture. Carl Jung, a man who spent his life trying to understand the human psyche, spoke often of archetypes, those images and symbols that are embedded in the collective unconscious of every human being. They are not learned or taught, they are instinctual. They are the same shadows that come to life when we close our eyes. The monster, in all its terrifying forms, is one of these archetypes. It is not merely a creature with a monstrous appearance, but a symbol of something hidden within all of us, a part of ourselves that we either fear or refuse to acknowledge. The monster is a reflection of the darkness we all carry inside. Jung believed that the unconscious mind is full of these symbolic figures, which can appear in dreams or in the stories we tell ourselves. When we look at a monster, we see not only the fear it evokes, but also the darkness inside ourselves that we are too afraid to face. Monsters, in this sense, represent the parts of ourselves we push away, our anger, our jealousy, our greed, and our desire for power. We cannot simply defeat them, we must confront them, understand them, and integrate them into our being. Think of the monsters in fairy tales, the dragon that must be slain, the witch that must be outsmarted, the demon that must be banished. These figures are more than just antagonists. They are the embodiment of the challenges we face within our own psyches. They represent the trials we must go through to become whole, to face our fears and overcome them. The slaying of the dragon is not just a physical act, it's a metaphor for confronting the part of yourself that you refuse to acknowledge. It's the journey into the dark places where you bury your pain and shame, and coming out the other side stronger, more complete. In every society, monsters take on different forms, but their essence remains the same. They represent the parts of human nature that are dangerous, that must be controlled or contained. In ancient mythology, monsters were often associated with chaos, destruction, and the unknown. They were the forces that threatened to tear the world apart. And yet, they were also necessary, for without the monster, there would be no hero, no journey, no transformation. The monster is the catalyst for growth. It forces the hero to confront something larger than themselves, something terrifying, something that demands change. The Jungian archetype of the monster doesn't just appear in myths or fairy tales, it appears in our everyday lives, in the fears we don't want to acknowledge, in the decisions we avoid, in the parts of our personality we keep hidden. Every time we experience something that makes us feel small, vulnerable, or out of control, we face the monster. It could be the fear of failure, the fear of rejection, or the fear of losing control. But those fears, as overwhelming as they are, hold the potential for growth. The moment we face the monster is the moment we are forced to change. Consider the stories that haunt us the most, the ones that stick with us long after we've read them, the ones that make our hearts race, our skin crawl. These are not just stories about fictional creatures, they are about our deepest fears made manifest. The monsters of modern horror films, whether they are vampires, werewolves, or ghosts, are no different from the monsters of ancient times. They symbolize something inside us that we are too afraid to confront. In modern media, we see the same monsters recurring again and again. They are the shadows that have never left us, even in the light of the modern world. They are the fears that grow with us, evolving as we do, always just beneath the surface. But what happens when we confront the monster? What happens when we no longer run from the darkness, but instead choose to walk into it? Jung believed that the only way to truly grow and evolve as individuals was to confront the monsters within, those parts of ourselves that we keep hidden in the dark. By facing the monster, we reclaim the power it holds over us. We no longer fear it. We understand it, and in doing so, we understand ourselves. In a sense, the monster is a teacher. It shows us what we are capable of when we face our fears head-on. It shows us that we are stronger than we think, that we can endure even the most terrifying challenges. The monster is the obstacle that stands between us and our true potential, and while it may seem like an adversary, it is also an ally. It is the force that forces us to change, to grow, to become who we are meant to be. When we look at the monsters of the past and the monsters of our own lives, we see that they are not so different. They are reflections of ourselves, and each time we encounter them, we have the opportunity to become more than we were before. The journey into the dark is never easy. It's a path full of fear, doubt, and uncertainty. But it's also a path that leads to discovery, to healing, and to strength. The monsters are not here to destroy us. They are here to help us understand who we are and what we are capable of. Only by facing them, by acknowledging the darkness within, can we ever truly step into the light. There's something about the darkness that pulls us in, a force that beckons with a quiet, irresistible whisper. It's the feeling that something unknown, is just beyond our reach, just out of sight. A figure lurking in the shadows, its shape shifting in and out of focus, its eyes glowing like embers in the night. Monsters have always captivated us, from the eerie glow of ancient campfires to the bright screens of today. But why do we return again and again to these creatures of fear and chaos? Why do we feel that chill down our spine at the mention of their names, even as we seek them out, craving their presence? Perhaps it's because monsters represent something universal, something that speaks to every part of us, even the parts we try to ignore. They are more than just creatures that haunt our nightmares. They are the embodiment of our greatest fears, our deepest desires, and our most unsettling truths. Every time we encounter a monster, we are forced to confront something within ourselves, something we cannot escape, no matter how far we run or how high we climb. There's a thrill in that confrontation, a rush of adrenaline that comes from facing what we cannot control. For centuries, we have been drawn to the monstrous, seeking out its stories and symbols, because in doing so, we make sense of our own inner turmoil. The monster may not always be real, but the fear it brings is. It's the kind of fear that awakens something primal, something ancient within us. The fear that makes our heart race, our breath catch in our throat, and our body freeze in place. The monster is a mirror, reflecting our own darkest thoughts, our most hidden emotions. And in that reflection, we see not just terror, but possibility. We have always created monsters, shaped them from the stuff of nightmares, as a way to make sense of the world around us. They are the symbol of chaos in a world that seeks order, the embodiment of the unknown in a universe we are still trying to understand. From the vast wilderness that surrounded our ancestors to the uncertainty of the future, monsters represent everything that lies just beyond our comprehension. They remind us that there is always something larger than us, something that cannot be tamed, something that cannot be controlled. And yet, as much as monsters terrify us, they also fascinate us. They are creatures of contradiction, both monstrous and human, terrifying and intriguing. We want to run from them, but we can't help but look back, captivated by their sheer power and unpredictability. There is a strange comfort in knowing that they exist, that we are not alone in our fear, that we are not the only ones wrestling with the darkness. It is this very fascination that keeps the monster alive, generation after generation, century after century. The monsters we face may change, but the fear they represent remains the same. In ancient times, they were the great beasts that roamed the earth, the dragons and demons that threatened to destroy everything we held dear. Today, they are the figures that lurk in the shadows of our minds, our fears, our insecurities, our doubts, and our struggles. But even in their terrifying form, monsters offer us something we cannot resist, a way to confront what we fear most, a way to understand the unknown, and perhaps even a way to conquer it. Think about it. The most memorable monsters are not the ones that simply scare us, but the ones that make us question everything we thought we knew. They push us to the edge of reason and then pull us back again. They make us confront the things we try to bury deep inside, things we would rather forget. Whether it's the vampire who reflects our own desires for immortality, or the werewolf who embodies the wildness within us, the monster is a symbol of the things we cannot easily explain. It is the fear that we are not as in control of our lives as we want to believe. It is the reminder that we, too, have darkness inside us, just waiting to emerge. Yet even in the darkest of monsters, there is a flicker of humanity. There is a reason we return to them over and over again, why we keep writing their stories, telling their tales. We want to understand them. We want to find a way to relate to them, to see ourselves in them. After all, aren't they just like us in some ways? They have their own struggles, their own desires, their own pain. Perhaps the monster is not as far removed from us as we like to think. In a way, the enduring fascination with monsters is the human fascination with our own limits, our own fears, and our own capacity for change. Each encounter with a monster is a test, a challenge to overcome what we fear most about ourselves. And yet, it is also a journey toward understanding. We are drawn to the monster because it holds a mirror up to us, showing us the parts of ourselves we would rather ignore, but also the parts of ourselves we can't help but be fascinated by. It's a dance, one step forward, two steps back. We run from the monster, only to find ourselves drawn back in. We try to banish it from our minds, but it always returns, more powerful than before. And maybe that's the point. The monster is not something to be defeated, it's something to be understood. It is not something to be feared, but something to be embraced. We create monsters because we need them, because they help us navigate the complexities of being human. Without them, without that reflection of our deepest, darkest fears, we might never fully understand ourselves. The monster may terrify us, but it also fascinates us because it is part of us. It lives in the darkest corners of our minds, and when we face it, we learn something new about who we are and what we are capable of. There's a strange beauty in that, an undeniable truth that we are, in some way, all monsters. And that, perhaps, is the greatest mystery of all. The ancient world whispers to us through the cracks in time, fragments of its lost stories scattered like forgotten bones in the earth. Somewhere between the dust of millennia lies a question that no one has yet answered: why did they create such monstrous beings? What drove the ancients to shape terrifying creatures, each more bizarre and horrifying than the last? The images they left behind, carvings, statues, paintings, show us beings that are part human, part animal, and something else entirely. These creatures, etched into the fabric of history, still haunt us, long after the civilizations that made them have crumbled to dust. But the questions they raise remain as sharp and jagged as the stone walls in which they were once trapped. Why do monsters appear in every corner of the ancient world, and cultures separated by thousands of miles and years? Why do we find them guarding temples, protecting secrets, and warning against the unknown? Were these creatures just the stuff of nightmares, or did they represent something far more profound? Perhaps the answers lie buried deep in the shifting sands of time, and perhaps they never will be answered at all. But as we search for meaning in these terrifying beings, we can't help but wonder, what do they tell us about ourselves? About the people who crafted them? And about the fears that still echo through our modern lives? The mystery of ancient monsters is far from over. We stand at the edge of a vast, dark sea of unknowns, our eyes straining to see the shape of what lies beneath the surface. Each new discovery, each new artifact, brings us closer to understanding, but also reveals how much more we still don't know. The monsters we know are only a fraction of the creatures that once filled the world of our ancestors. How many more beings lie hidden in the forgotten corners of history, waiting for someone to find them? How many stories remain untold, locked away in the fragments of ancient texts that have yet to be translated? What can the monsters teach us about the ancient mind, and how will they help us understand the fears and desires that shaped the earliest civilizations? These questions linger like a fog, heavy and thick, refusing to lift. And yet, every new revelation sparks something deep within us, a flicker of recognition, a moment of clarity, a chilling realization that we are not so different from those who came before us. The monsters they created were not just creations of the mind, they were mirrors, reflecting the truths that the ancients struggled to understand. They were the personifications of fear, desire, power, and mystery. And in many ways, they were just as real to those who believed in them as the people who lived and breathed in the same world. But even as we seek answers, we find that some things will always remain just beyond our reach. What did the monsters mean to those who carved them into stone or shaped them from clay? Were they meant to protect or to terrorize? Were they the guardians of knowledge or the enforcers of law? Or were they simply warnings, reminders of the dangers lurking just beyond the borders of civilization? The monsters of the ancient world refuse to be neatly categorized or easily explained. They are, in a sense, the perfect enigma, always just out of focus, always just beyond our understanding. And so we are left with the mysteries, the unanswered questions that drive us to look deeper, to search further. Each new discovery raises more questions than it answers. What do we make of the strange hybrid creatures that appear across cultures, creatures that mix human and animal traits in ways that defy reason? What did it mean to the people who first created them, and what does it mean to us today? Are these monsters just the product of an overactive imagination, or do they represent something deeper, something universal? What is it about the blending of the human and the monstrous that so captivates our collective imagination? There is something haunting about these creatures, something unsettling in their eyes, their twisted forms, their silent watch over forgotten ruins. Perhaps it's the reminder that we are not as far removed from the ancients as we like to believe. These monsters, these guardians of ancient secrets, still resonate with us today. They continue to haunt our nightmares, to crawl beneath the surface of our modern fears. What is it about them that continues to captivate us, even in an age of reason and science? In the quiet moments, when the world feels still, the question lingers, what do we still have to learn from the monsters of the past? What have they left us, and what have we left them? Maybe, just maybe, we're meant to carry on the work they started, to listen to their stories, to find meaning in the creatures that still walk with us in the dark. Maybe the monsters are not just remnants of the past, they are part of the ever-evolving narrative of humanity itself. And as long as we continue to tell their stories, as long as we continue to confront our deepest fears, they will never be truly gone. The legacy of ancient monsters will continue to haunt us, to inspire us, and to challenge us. We may never fully understand why these creatures were created, or what they meant to the people who worshipped them. But we can never deny their power, their presence, and their ability to touch something deep within us, something that transcends time and space. The monsters may have been born in the past, but they are still with us, living on in our stories, our art, and in the dark corners of our own hearts. The questions may remain unanswered, but the search will never stop. And perhaps, in that search, we will find something we never expected, a deeper understanding of ourselves and of the world we have inherited.